this via email. I read this.
When I looked and you weren't alarmed, I was no longer alarmed.
I'm always alarmed.
We got room up here. Nobody cares. You'll see oil down my backyard too.
Good evening. I'm going to call the Board of Selectmen's meeting for August 30th, 2021 to order. Would you please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Public comment announcement. Joe, will you do the first one?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening to you and the members of the board and to the public here assembled and on TV. It's my pleasure to announce the availability of our non-resident taxpayer video. As you know, in years past, we've been able to conduct an annual non-resident taxpayer meeting. Last year, due to COVID, we were unfortunately unable to do that in person. However, a positive offshoot from that is that the video was very well received. Based on that and working with Jamie Goodwin and Caleb Ledoux, our Channel 18 team, many department heads and myself participated in that video, and pleased to announce that it's now available on the town's website. And as always, if anybody has any questions, they can reach out to staff and we'll certainly follow up. But that video is now available.
Thank you, Joe. To the folks that just arrived, there's a couple seats up front, one here and one over here. There's two up front so far, and we have more chairs right behind this screen here.
All right, we'll grab more. Thank you.
You're welcome. Jamie, do you want them to slide towards the back?
I think that'll be all right. We can put some chairs over here too.
Okay. Yeah. Ed, if we bring that one over closer to Jamie, please. First time ever. Thank you. Anyone else for public comment announcement? Hearing no one, I'm going to move right into the presentation by GHD on the sewer CAD model review.
No, consent agenda.
Oh, consent agenda. We have one consent agenda. Mary?
I move that we vote to accept a gift from the Aura Gaylord A. Ruth Trust to the Community Center in the amount of $11,400.
Second.
Moved in second. Any discussion?
None.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. 4-0, Joe?
Thank you.
Okay, now we'll move into the presentation by GHD on the sewer CAD modeling.
Where'd Dan go? Did we lose Dan?
Good evening. Russ Cwmp. I'm an engineer with GHD. With me tonight, Jim O'Brien, another one of our designers at GHD, and we also have Mark Drainville and Lennox Quackenbush in the crowd. We're the team that's working on the sewer model for the town of Harwich. So at the last meeting, a few weeks or maybe a month ago, we shared with the board some locations for pump station sites. As you know, we're putting together a sewer CAD, and what CAD stands for is computer aided design. I know we hear this term all the time, AutoCAD, sewer CAD, blah, blah, blah. So the model basically designs your sewer system for you. You put some design input in the start. The most important is where your pump station locations are. So at the last meeting, we had 33 pump station sites. We were given the design criteria to say, okay, how far can we extend gravity sewers if we look at a maximum depth of 20 feet. So with that, we did it all. We put it into Google Earth. Maybe, Jim, you can zoom in a little bit more. So what you're looking at on the screen here is the blue parcels are the parcels that will be served by gravity if we design the gravity sewers to a depth of 20 feet. The yellow parcels are ones that we cannot extend the gravity sewers to based on our pump station locations based on a depth of 20 feet. So our options for the yellow parcels would either be grinder pumps or low pressure sewers. We could put another pump station. We could find a site within the cluster of yellow parcels and put another sewer pump station there. Or they can be left unsewered. Now again, this was I don't want to say desktop analysis because we did physically go out to each pump station site. But again, this just shows the maximum extent of the gravity sewers and then some areas that we have to make a decision on tonight. And we can either have a discussion about that or some guidance moving forward, because what is critical with this is, this is a huge task, the wastewater planning in general. And you become lost in the details. There's all these different topics, but it's very important to break it down into smaller sections and go piece by piece by piece by piece. So we had a very productive piece last time, which was a selection of the pump station locations. The piece tonight is the discussion about the extent of the gravity sewer coverage. And the next step is the step that talks about the flows and the loads. And I know just through what's been in the media, through discussion with town staff, through the water cooler talk, that obviously the flows, especially the future flows, are a hot topic. We're trying to pin these down and get them as accurate as possible. From a modeling perspective, the flows are very simply input. Typically, how we do this, and we've done this with towns in the past, is we look at the last 5 years of the existing water use information. We take the highest year water use information, and we go on a parcel by parcel basis with whatever the highest year. I think for Harwich, it was either 2016 or 2020.
We used 2020 was the
2020. So we used the year 2020 flows. We took the actual water use from each parcel. We assign it to the parcel that you're looking at, and then that gets assigned to one of those green dots, which is the sewer manholes. So it's a very accurate way to put the flows in. But then the question is, well, what about future flows? We can either discuss, happy to answer any questions about it tonight, but in my opinion, it's a little premature at this meeting to talk about that, because we really need to get the extent of the gravity sewers and the low pressure sewers before we start adding flows. But again, happy to, talk about how we do that. From the model standpoint, it's very simple to put in flows, change flows, do different scenarios. I'm assuming that the future build-out projections, as much as I'd like to say we'll get it right on the first attempt, I'm guessing that they're going to change and they're going to be developed, as the progression of the wastewater planning happens. So the flows are very, very simple to input. But that's really, the basics behind the model. The nice thing about this is all the information. Jim, if you zoom into, a manhole and click on it, you can zoom in. You can click on any one of these again, this is on Google Earth. We load in a KMZ file, so if you click on a manhole, you get all the information about that. And the important piece is this one right here, depth, 11.3 feet. So for any road in town, every sewer main, we know exactly how deep it's going to be. And this is all based off the LiDAR information, which is your topographic information, which is accurate to about plus or minus 6 inches. So back when we were doing this 20 years ago for other towns, we had contours that were plus or minus, 3 feet. So, the models would change a lot when you get the actual information. But since we have such good information to start with, we can really get a good idea of how deep the sewers are going to be, the extent, where they're going to go. And those are really the big things in the planning process of this. We did add, I think we had 32 or 33 pump stations at the last meeting. We did add 3 additional pump stations. As we were putting the model together, there was a few larger gaps, and then just based on our experience, we picked, it was either town-owned parcels. I think we had 3, Jim. Yeah, we had one on Route 28 in the parking lot at Town Hall, which we felt was hopefully be a suitable location if we had to put one here.
That was one.
That one's.
And one on.
Yep, this is not. That's not the one on 28. That's Queen Anne Road, is it?
Yeah. Let me ask any questions or any comments. You're gonna have to stand up to the mic, and when he's done with his presentation, I'll open it up. Any discussion in the audience leads to feedback on the camera, and the people at home won't be able to hear the presentation. So no talking unless you've been called, and you stand up at the mic, please.
So that's in the, off Queen Anne Road on an undeveloped parcel. We have another one in the town hall parking lot, and then we have another one on the town line with the town of Dennis. So this is where which one? Let's go down to the town of Dennis on the town line down there. Yeah, further down. Yeah, we have the Main Interceptor. Okay, that's the one, yeah. So this was another one that we added. That's actually a residential parcel, but it's on an undevelopable piece of land. And I should also note that when you see the green parcels on this, that those are either undevelopable parcels based on the town's assessor's information, or conservation land, or some other land that we felt would be a good, potentially a good option for a pump station, if indeed the town goes to this route. And again, this model is being developed to satisfy the town's obligation to develop a design for conventional sewering. Through the next agenda item, the discussions with the changes to the Cwmp, that's where we talk about the IA systems. And so we're not trying, this is strictly what we were scoped out to do for conventional sewering. It has nothing to do with the IA systems or anything like that. And again, more than happy to answer questions, but it wasn't under the specific scope of this modeling. And that's the one, the additional pump station we put for the town hall parking lot.
Yeah.
So let's zoom down to the boundary with the town of Dennis. So this is interesting here. When we originally laid out, zoom out a little bit, Jim? A little bit more? Okay, so our town of Harwich, obviously right here, town of Dennis over here. Here is Division Street,
Yeah.
right? Division Street, which is the town boundary. So we had originally had the sewer CAD, the way we designed it was with all of our pipes coming off Division Street going down the neighborhoods. But said, this is busy area of the town of Dennis. So we actually reached out to staff, the town engineer at the town of Dennis, and talked to them and said, and the whole reason we did that is because if you have one main that runs up and down Division Street, which falls on the town line, do we start thinking now making provisions in the future for Dennis to tie in? I know that's, there's discussion, IMA, all these sort of things that go along with that, but at least from a design standpoint, we want to know what's feasible and what's not feasible. So we actually did my little red light stopped working. Okay. So we actually did extend sewers out into the town of Dennis through the sewer CAD modeling as well. We're not showing it for this presentation, but we wanted to see what was feasible if we do end up running the sewer line down Division Street. I know that there was some talk about, I know the town wanted to look at IMAs for future connections to potentially to the town of Dennis. So this might be an opportunity, and this was my big picture when I first thought about it, is if Dennis contributes flow into Harwich, and then Harwich contributes back to Dennis, there may be a balance there, or that might be a benefit for both towns. Again, that's future, that's later on down the line, but we did take that into consideration when we came up with the Seward area around Division Street. I will take a short break there, pause for any questions, concerns, comments.
Sure. Don?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You repeatedly said Route 28, but you also repeatedly said Town Hall. Did you mean the Chamber of Commerce parking lot on Route 28, or?
Yeah, do you want?
Chamber of Commerce, yeah.
That's, I'm
Because you're
sorry,
sitting in Town
Chamber
Hall.
of Commerce, I apologize.
That's okay.
Any questions, Don?
No.
Mary?
No.
Larry?
Thank you, Russ. I have one question. When you talk about the low-pressure areas,
Sure.
and you said we had a couple options. One was to put in low-pressure pumps. The second one was to go somewhere else. Do we then, this is, the sites we're going after is to remove the requisite nitrogen. So does that mean we have to pick up some areas elsewhere? And if you looked at that then, is where we would go to keep the nitrogen full to meet the TMDLs?
Very good question. So, yes, that would be one of the first things when we make those decisions with, okay, what do we do with these yellow parcels that we can't reach with our 20-foot deep gravity sewers? Yeah, we'd look at, so what's the nitrogen removal rate within that watershed? And if we don't need the sewer, then that might be a very obvious answer. Well, we just don't need the sewer.
Yeah.
If you do need to capture those parcels to meet your nitrogen removal rates, then you just have to make the decision, do we either put the sewers deeper, do we add a pump station, do we look at
Or do
IA
we look at somewhere
technologies,
else
or
in
do we
IA,
look at
yeah.
low-pressure technologies? But we're just trying to, again, I know that I think I've heard some discussion about how it's the town may not want low-pressure sewers, and you know, all we can really give you is the information so that the board can make the decision. We're not gonna decide on what your future flows are. We're not gonna tell you what your best sewer. We'll just give you the pros and cons, and then, you know, it's up to the wastewater superintendent and the.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yep, sure.
You all set, Larry?
Yeah, I am.
Anyone in the public for where he's at right now? If you want to speak, go up to the podium.
Sure.
And just say, state your name for the record.
Yes. Pretty simple. Kathy Globridge. I just don't get the acronyms. So there were like IMA, IA, whatever. So could you just clarify when you're using and could you rewind and tell us what those mean?
Thank you.
Sure.
Great
Let
question.
me apologize up front.
No
Yes,
worries.
engineers love to talk in acronyms because we hear it a million times a day, and I try to explain those. So IA is Innovative Alternative. It's an enhanced type of a septic system for an individual property. Right now, under the state laws, you have Title V septic systems, which really don't remove nitrogen. The wastewater coming out of those can be anywhere from 30 to 50 plus milligrams per liter of a nitrogen concentration. An innovative alternative system gets it down to roughly 10 milligrams per liter, so it's a tremendous improvement over traditional septic systems. IMA is an intermunicipal agreement.
Okay.
So, you know, there's been a lot of talk about DHY and all these other things. There's two ways, when you have multiple towns that share wastewater services, the two main, I guess, the two main ways they come together is either through a regionalization, which was, you know, the DHY regionalization project, or they can have what's called an intermunicipal agreement. Right now, the town of Harwich has an intermunicipal agreement with the town of Chatham to pump X amount of gallons a day to the town. The town of Bourne has an IMA with the town of Wareham. They pump 200,000 gallons a day. They're both very common, and it just depends on, you know, there's a lot of factors when they form up, when they get formed, I should say, that usually dictate what's in the partner's best interest, either a regionalization or an IMA. If you're a small user or a small customer, IMAs generally, you tend to see them more. But again, that's kind of outside where we're talking now, under the scope of this project.
And one last TDMLs.
TDM.
TMLDs.
TMDLs.
TMDLs.
Total
TMDLs, yeah. My total
maximum daily
load.
load.
Got it. Limit.
Limit.
Total maximum daily limit.
Thanks a village.
It's yeah. I'm technically on vacation now, so cut me a little slack with this.
I should have asked Larry that, because he said that.
Well, I do too, because there's a toxicology threshold that uses the same initials that means something else, and so or just reverse, and so I get them confused too.
Claire McClarty, East Harwich. The large areas of town that aren't colored at all, are those ineligible for gravity-fed sewer, or are they just areas that don't need nitrogen removal?
Yep. So we were given, the town provided us with the figure of kind of defined areas to sewer. So what you're seeing is literally the defined outline of what we were asked to sewer.
Anyone else?
Oh, and I can even show, you know what, I didn't even, thanks for pulling
You
this
know,
up.
if I may, Michael, a good question. I think that might be good to expand that a bit, because using the TMLDs and the modeling and all that, you know, we've gone from initial trying to say what would happen if we sewered everything to what we have to sewer to meet those limits. So that's why we don't sewer the whole areas. That's also why we could move somewhere else if we needed to.
And that was based on the town's original phasing from this, which is this figure here that you're seeing. So that's how we developed that's correct. That's the limits of where we were modeling.
Thanks, Russ.
But you know what, Jim brings up another good point. Just, it's really neat how this model comes together. So how we actually do this, we start this in AutoCAD. We actually draft this. And Jim, why don't you just jump over real quick? So this is an AutoCAD. This is a different software. We lay everything out. And it's still, you know, I know it looks like a bunch of lines and dots and hey, what is all this sort of stuff? But these are where we start with the sewer mains. And we profile everything. We have the stationing. And Jim, if you can zoom out and show a profile. So down below, this is the profile of all, and I really wish my little laser pointer worked here. Can I get up and point at this?
You can.
So what this is here is, this is your ground elevation, and that's based on the LiDAR information, which comes from the states, plus or minus 6 inches of accuracy. So it's a very accurate representation of what the ground elevation is. These are all your sewer manholes, and these are your sewer pipes that all have to flow, you know, gravity sewers all have to flow downhill to where they come to a pump station that pumps it to either the next sewer system or the treatment facility. So once we have this all done in AutoCAD, Jim, if you can zoom out. Yeah. We take this and we put this into GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems. Did I get that, Sandy? So when we put it into GIS, this is where it gets really cool. This, just going back, we did this, Jim and I came up with this about, 18, 20 years ago. We were doing this for the town of Chatham. We were actually able to put all the manholes into GIS, and then you can export all the information to SewerCAD. It's a ton of work to do it longhand, but if you use the software, it makes it very, very efficient. So when it's all in the Geographic Information System, we take it from here, and then we export this as a file into the SewerCAD software. But we want to make sure that we get all the pump station locations and any other areas that we may need to extend the gravity sewers correct in the GIS, because we really, once we put it into SewerCAD, we want to have everything correct there. We don't want to be doing a lot of changes. It's a little clunky in SewerCAD to keep doing all the changes. So that's how the whole process comes together. So again, we have profiles, and really, I know we keep calling it the sewer model, but what we really have is a conceptual sewer design of all the wastewater infrastructure for the town of Harwich, which is a tremendous amount of information. It's very helpful, very useful to have when we start saying, okay, we have a sewer here that's 20 feet deep. What does this road look like? On a GIS map, it just looks like 2 lines on a piece of paper, but when you actually drive out there, it might be a 12-foot wide, dirt road, and then you see it, say, hey, are we really gonna put a sewer pipe 20 feet down here? Is that realistic? So that's when everything we do on desktop, it does have to be verified in the field to make sure that it's, because you see it a million times. It may look good on paper, but in real life, you have to go up and make sure that it's feasible. So that's how the whole thing comes together.
Continue. Any question?
Marilyn Kavaleski. I just have a question for the people that can't be gravity fed and they have the pump. If they lose their electricity, are they unable to flush their toilets and things, or is there some kind of new process that there's generators hooked up to keep the flow going?
Sure. So that's a very good question about low pressure systems and grinder pumps, and every town, they do things kind of their own way, what they think is best. And I'll give you a couple 4 examples of what other towns do when that exact situation happens. So for example, town of Wareham, they have a lot of low pressure around town, so they actually have a dedicated crew when there's a power outage. Obviously, if you have your own generator, the problem's solved. But for the majority of folks that don't have a generator, you got this little E1 grinder pump station. They have a dedicated crew that has a trailer-mounted generator, and they go to each grinder pump on a rotational basis, and they pump that out. So that's the town of Wareham. They take ownership of when there's a power outage. You can still flush the toilet, but those grinder pumps do have a finite capacity. I forget the exact gallonage. It might be 50 or 60 gallons. So you can only flush the toilet so many times until that fills up, that grinder pump. So, is there more work with the grinder pump from a homeowner's perspective? Absolutely, it's a mechanical system. But who's responsible for that work? And again, we're kind of talking longer term, but I can talk about what other towns have done with the low pressure systems. What the benefits of low pressure systems are is a couple. Because they're a pressurized system, they do not allow any type of excess water to get into the system. That's known as I&I, which is infiltration and inflow. Meaning when it rains a lot, if it comes in through the manholes, a lot of the old sewers get a lot of infiltration and inflow. And what basically happens is that the town is paying money to treat clean water, which is a waste of money, which we don't want to do. So in fact, some towns, like Wareham, have said, we're only going to do low pressure because we have so much I&I coming into our system. Now that's an existing sewer system that's aged. It was built years ago. Town of Harwich is moving for brand new sewers, so I&I should not be as big of a concern. You still have to be aware of it. But that's one of the benefits of the low. Plus, another really, from a sewer operator's point of view, one of the biggest problems with maintaining a municipal sewer system is what people flush down the toilet. Toilet paper should be the only thing flushed down the toilet. Is it the only thing flushed down the toilet? Absolutely not. We all remember when COVID hit, when there was no toilet paper on the shelves. What did people start flushing down? sleeves of t-shirts, towels, whatever you can find. So, and this is an interesting story. So what
Sears
happens,
catalog.
if I start going, I have a tendency to kind of just tell me to reel it in if I start going down. So what happened was, everybody's flushing all this sort of stuff down the toilet because there's no toilet paper. The sewer pumps get clogged up. Well, they have to go, the staff has to go knee-deep in wastewater, unclog these sewer pumps, but because it was the pandemic, the impellers that got clogged up, you couldn't order them. They're on back order. So now we have a pump station that's out of service because it's getting all these rags and, things that shouldn't be flushed down the toilet. And when a pump station goes out of service, it overflows, goes into a shellfishing area. It's a big issue. And that's what happens when you flush things. So make a note, please, only toilet paper goes down the toilet. But from an operator's, when you have a grinder pump or one of these low pressure pumps, it macerates from that individual home. So you don't have those blockages at pump stations when you have grinder pumps pumping into it. So a lot of operators and owners of sewer systems like grinder pumps for that reason, because they don't have to deal with the clogs. Just because you flush a toilet and it goes away doesn't mean it's forgotten. Somebody has to deal with it at some point down the line. So those are the benefits of the low pressure, is that there's no I&I, and it reduces malfunctions at pump stations. But, the negative from a homeowner's perspective is you have a little mini pump station in your front yard. Some people might like that. Some people say, no way, I don't want this in my front yard. And in some cases, if we have to put a sewer down extremely deep just to reach one or two more houses, does that really make sense? Not really, and unfortunately, it's based on the topography of where your property is, and whether or not we can reach it with the sewers. So those are the challenges, the questions that we have to answer as planners and engineers to make a decision that's in the best interest of the public.
Thank you, Russ.
Really, with the presentation, for the first part, we just wanted to go over the extent of the coverage. Now, Jim, if we can go back to Google Earth. We do have some areas in yellow, and obviously we'll look at what the removal rates are for nitrogen, but if the board had a preference, what would you like to see? Would you like to see how deep the sewers would have to be to get those areas 100%? We can come back and tell you, hey, you're gonna have to put your sewers 35 feet deep if you wanna run a gravity line. We hear this magical number of 20 feet of cover, and where does this come from, and all this sort of stuff? Well, A, it's the installation. Heavy equipment can only dig so deep. You've been through this. I understand you have some sewers that are deeper than that, so I don't have to. But the other thing you want to be concerned about is the deeper the sewers, the more weight is on top of the pipe. Traditionally, sewers are made with PVC or plastic pipes, which is what you want because they're corrosion resistant. Sewage develops hydrogen sulfide, which can eat away concrete and cement, and that's a big issue for force mains that don't have clean out structures. I'll clarify that. So once the pump station collects the flow, it pumps it through a force main. Did you remember what happened in Plymouth a few years ago? They had a major force main break that pumped the entire towns. It was because of a hydrogen sulfide buildup. There was also maintenance issues, but when you have a force main that does this, it goes up and down. At every high point, you want to have what they call an air release valve, because that hydrogen sulfide accumulates at those high points. And any place where you have the hydrogen sulfide, it eats away concrete, and it has a tendency to eat away the metal pipes. So you really want to look at PVC or plastic-based pipes when you're doing sewer construction. Unfortunately, when you go super deep, you have a lot of weight on top of that. So potentially the PVC might not be strong enough, so you have to switch over to a ductile iron or an iron pipe that, in gravity situations, hydrogen sulfide isn't as much of a concern in pressure applications, but again, you're changing materials to a less desirable material. So there's other things to think about too when you go at 30 feet deep. Well, what if, something breaks down there, a piece of pipeline breaks, you have to dig 30 feet down to fix it. And even putting personnel 30 feet down a manhole, I don't know, show of hands, how many people have been 20 feet down in a sewer manhole? I don't want to go any deeper than 20 feet. That's as deep as I go. And it's, from a safety standpoint.
A lot deeper than I'm going.
So that's why we stick to we really try to keep it at 20 feet. So I guess what would be really helpful from the board is, what would you like us to do with these yellow areas? Either tell you how deep sewers have to be, just say, well, model it with low pressure, or do we want to add a pump station? Do you want to look at each one of those yellow areas and see if you can add a pump station? But some of these yellow areas are only 2, 3, 4 parcels. It really doesn't make sense to put in a dedicated pump station for a handful of parcels. Believe it or not, there is a town I've worked for that has one house tied to one pump station. Don't ask. It's crazy. But somewhere around, we did a financial analysis years ago for another town, and it was somewhere around 12 or 15, it was like either 12 or 15 parcels. If it's more than that from a financial standpoint, the cost, it makes more sense to look at another sewer pump station. We'd have to revisit those numbers if you wanted to really get a good idea of what that parcel cutoff is. But maybe as a first step, we could tell you how deep the sewers would have to be based on our pump station locations to capture those areas. I got a feeling it's gonna drive them fairly deep, and we may not wanna do that. And then, so maybe we come back with a plan B, a potential pump station site for the yellow clusters that could fit it. And if it's an area where it's only 2 or 3 yellow parcels, we'd probably say either low pressure is probably your best bet for something like that.
Thank you, Russ. I'm going to open up to the board. Larry? To that question?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, you've raised some points on the extra parcels. I guess one question I would throw into the mix is the numbers of properties you're talking about. Because I think in the past, when we've had some of these preliminary discussions, in some of our smaller groups, the discussions come up of who pays for what. And I think one alternative that sometimes I think have done is for the towns to pay for the grinder pumps, and then homeowner pays for the maintenance after that. So there's some, ownership of the grinder pumps, but they're not taking the upfront costs and putting them in there. So if just from a purely cost perspective for the town, it'd be nice to know, one of the questions I have is how many grinder pumps are we talking about? And is that something in each area, is that something we want them to pick up to make it convenient for the homeowners to do it?
So Jim just told me that the number of parcels that are yellow, 775? Is that it? So there's,
Okay.
but those are parcels, so you have to
yeah.
look a little closer. Are they subdivided? Are there,
Right, what's that mean?
but just a strict parcel?
But that's
basis?
just a question I would throw into the mix of how that
Sure, how do you,
works out.
because if it's a lot, that might be a different way of procurement, how you get them, how you divvy them out. I know some towns do all the maintenance
Right.
on them.
Yeah, there's several discussions, but that's the question I
Is
would
there a
throw
simple
into it.
way on the yellow parcels to get the number of existing buildings?
No.
Okay. So,
I can just, there's,
we'll get an answer for that question. How many buildings are,
Yeah.
not necessarily parcels, but how many buildings are in the low-pressure area?
this is the gravity.
Mary?
I would think while we're in the planning stage, we would want all of that. How many would require that? And then beyond that, how many could we not do because we don't need to sewer all of that area? But I would think while you're in the planning stage, I'd like all that data.
Don?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's exactly what I was thinking.
It's like we're twins.
So we have number of buildings, number of parcels, potentially how deep would the sewers need to be if we wanted to stay with the pump stations, and if we were to keep the sewers at 20 feet, if we were to add additional pump stations, where would the best locations be? So those 3 items.
And the requirement to sewer,
And the requirement to sewer, based on, correct, the
based on what we're removing from other areas.
And I think we also talked about the possibility of one-off IAs as you're doing that examination.
Correct. Which will come in depending on what the nitrogen removal rate is, whether or not, if we have to do 100% or if there's a less percentage, that will dictate the extent of the gravity, and then also the potential for IAs and other technologies.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Russ. Larry, any
Good, well,
further?
yeah, because that's a good question, because it could be that we move to the outlying areas, IAs work, and maybe you have to add IAs to a few more homes to get the nitrogen removal that you get through sewers, and so
Correct.
that's a good calculation to be worthwhile knowing.
Yep.
Thank you. Gentleman in the second row?
George Vermillier, 7 Wooded Drive in Harwich. There's nothing on your agenda that speaks to the letter that I sent to the board regarding Phase 2 and the elimination of Continental and Wooded Drive from the sewer installation. Are you going to discuss any of that tonight? Because that's mainly why all these folks are here.
If it's not on the agenda, there's no discussion on it. When Dan Pelletier gets up, our water superintendent, there is some recommendations that he's going to make, and I believe that relates to those roads.
So you will be covering some of that.
Dan? Yes, sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else on where we're at right now? Okay, Russ, do you want to get into the?
You have a question here, I think, from Ed.
Ed McManus, I guess the issue of doing the planning, it basically all comes to a point of trade-offs, how deep you go and how much area you cover. Is there a way, well, one, part of the other information not only are how many buildings will need grinder pumps, but how many buildings are serviced by the gravity flow as you have it. And then the question is, it's all about finding that sweet spot.
Sure.
And, at 20 feet, this is the results you get. At 28, you may be able to do it 100%. What if you go 21 feet? How much more do you pick up? So is there a way to do that analysis?
Sure, so I think one of the options we're gonna look at is what would that depth have to be if we wanted to get 100% of these parcels by gravity? So rather than saying, what can we sewer with 21 feet or 28 feet, we're gonna come back and say, okay, to get everything 100%, you have to go to 29 feet or 32 feet or whatever it may be. So yes, we can definitely look into that. And you're right with the trade-off. I mean, it's ultimately what your nitrogen removal rate is, and then what makes the most financial sense. I mean, what's the cheapest cost alternative to meet the goals of the project? If the goals of the project is to meet your nitrogen removal rates, I mean, the sweet spot is what's the, I don't want to say cheapest, but the lowest cost alternative. Yep.
Thank you. Sandy?
Sandy McClarty, East Harwich. Just to tie into that last comment of the goal and what that target is, I've asked this before, but I think the figuring out I know it's in future discussions, the build out, but figuring out what our goal is will play a part into how close we are. So, for example, how close are we to our target with the old plan, with what you have there? And then based on our new build-out assumptions, that would answer the question, do we even need to look at some of these yellow parcels? I feel like it's going to inform that question, whether we need to, if we're already over-sewering or under-sewering, but if we're over-sewering, then, we don't need to keep going. So I feel like it's part of the same discussion. Let's figure out what our TMDLs are based on all of our needs. As we've got to clean the water up. We've got to plan for future growth. How much growth? All of these factors, let's put it all into the equation. And then I think from there you figure out, okay, we need 100 homes or 300 homes or whatever it is. I feel like that we want to keep the horse in front of the cart.
Sure.
Thank you.
So my response for that is 100%. All of these questions are part of the discussion. And I'm not saying this to try to dodge the issue at hand, but it's what's part of our scope as well. So our scope was just to do a gravity model with these extents. Now, we're going to talk momentarily about the modifications to the Cwmp, which will cover some of those topics, but it sounds like we're getting interest on, obviously what's the nitrogen removal rate. So I'm safe to say we'd be happy to look at what those removal rates are and work with the wastewater superintendent. And then maybe the next time we come back, we look at the model and what the extents for the conventional sewering method have to be to meet your nitrogen limits. Not necessarily, okay, here's this hard outline, here's your design criteria, just model it and see where you stand. So we can come back and look at those removal rates, and then would be better suited to answer that question. That you're absolutely right. That dictates how far you have to extend sewers, how many properties need it, and low pressure might be a moot point. May not even need it. So.
Thank you, Russ.
Hello, Patrick Otten, East Harwich. You stated that you were given this plan by the board, and that's what you're vetting out here?
It's the sewer phasing plan that was in the Cwmp.
Okay, so that's where that came from.
Correct.
Okay. So, given that it was from the Cwmp, do you see any variability here that could expand the efficiency, or do you have to stick exactly to that Cwmp layout and plan? When you're looking at all this, can you say, wow, if we did this over here, wouldn't it make more sense than what you've been handed?
That's an excellent prelude to the next agenda item, which is how we change the Cwmp. And there is a formal process called So I'm going to say the full word before I say the acronym. Notice of Project Change, or NOPC. So, yes, so absolutely. And the CWMP, you know, what that is it's a guidance document. It basically spells out what a town's going to do for the next 20 years, how they're going to manage their wastewater. But it's a living document. You know, 5 years from now, there could be another technology that, you know, we're looking at them right now that are in other countries overseas. The problem is we're kind of forced to use the technologies that are approved by Mass DEP. So even if there is some great technology out there, we can't use it until Mass DEP accepts it. But 5 years from now, if Mass DEP accepts some brand new technology that revolutionized wastewater treatment, of course we're going to modify the CWMP. And just because, oh, no, we have to do conventional sewers, that's what we said 5 years ago. No, so we have to change with the technology, and that's, as engineers, that's what we do. We do what's the most suitable technology. So yes, we absolutely see changes. It's impossible to predict what you're going to do 20 years from now. So, yes.
I guess then, as a follow-on question to just your comments now, do you see any recommendations that we should be looking at to do the next change of the CWMP as you're reviewing what you're doing here? I mean, you're now the intelligence, right? You know what's going on.
He's on vacation.
Oh, sorry.
Plus, it's after 5 p.m., so I don't know.
No, but you may say, you know, by the way, if we did this, it makes sense. Let's go make that change.
Yeah, so you know, as consultants, you know, and this is how we do business is that.
He wants to go on vacation too.
You know, so we try not to make decisions for the towns. We try to give them the information they need to make the decisions. So yes, if we see things in your existing CWMP that, through our experience in doing wastewater planning for other towns, that we think that the town of Harwich should look at, absolutely, we're going to bring up and say, but we're not going to say you have to do it. But of course, that's why, you know, we work with multiple towns on Cape Cod. Every town has to deal with wastewater, but every town does a little bit different. And, you know, hopefully we can gain on the mistakes of others and you know, build from that. So, yep.
Thank you, Russ. You want to move on to the next piece?
Sure. I'm actually going to, for the discussion about the CWMP, I'm going to invite Mark Drainville up to talk about that piece, and Jim and I are going to excuse ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I apologize, I don't have any cool graphics to show you. It's all right. It's all going to be a discussion. So in your packets, there is a memo that we put together, and I'm just going to give a little bit of background on it to start. So my name is Mark Drainville from GHD. I'm a principal with GHD, and we've been working with Joe and Dan and Griffin when he was here, looking at some of the changes that were desired to be made to the CWMP, the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan. So we've been collecting information from them, and then what we did is we had conversations with the state, and I'll talk through those. So first of all, let me talk a little bit about a couple of background things. So Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan, CWMP, yours was completed in 2016. In order to go through that approval, you work through a department within the state called MEPA, Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act Office. And MEPA deals with large projects that trip environmental thresholds. So for example, your plan included extensive sewering, and that was enough to have your project go through this MEPA office. And so we've been working with MEPA as part of this discussion. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background on that. So in some of our discussions early on with Joe and Dan and Griffin, there's a series of items that came up as items that would be desired to be looked at again and in the CWMP. One of them was to take a fresh look at the growth assumptions for the town. So this would be a combination of population projections as well as developmental growth. So that was one of the primary initial steps. A second one was to take another look at IA systems, so innovative and alternative on-site septic systems. Since the CWP was done back in 16, newer IA systems that are approaching lower limits are closer to a reality. They are in what's called a provisional approval state within the state, and maybe within 2 to 3 years they might be just allowed to go onto properties. Okay, so not fully approved yet by the state, but they're approaching that status. Other things that have changed a bit since 2016 is the landscape of working with neighboring towns. So for example, there were discussions about DHY being a wastewater treatment entity in the town of Dennis. That may or may not happen at this point. Perhaps there are opportunities, at least for Harwich, to work with the town of Dennis if they create their own wastewater treatment facility, so that would be potentially through an intermunicipal agreement. Another opportunity that may be out there is to work with the town of Brewster to perhaps collect some flow from them. So there's just opportunities that may not have been fully available at the time, or have changed at least. So that's something that would have to be reconsidered. Another major item is to take a look at project costs again, and to take those costs and to work with the town finance department, and to figure out how they can be implemented and worked within some of the other expenses of the town, some other major expenditures that the town may have. And then continue public presentations, and then to ultimately document the findings in a report. So the report, and Russ alluded to this, the report that is likely to be needed in this particular case is something that's called a notice of project change. It's a little bit of a clumsy term, but that's a term that MIPA has for changes to an approved CWMP. Okay, so you're changing an approved document, so they have a process that they would like you to go through in order to do that. We've had several conversations with the MIPA office, and their recommendation is that the town go through some of the initial reconsideration of growth and IA systems, and to see what potential impact that may have on the plan itself that you have, and then to go back to MIPA, and they can provide some kind of final guidance on what the document might be that would be needed to document all these changes. So it's likely to be this notice of project change, but there is another option they brought up, and they would like the town to go back before them once the impacts are known. The document that I provided to you has some very specific tasks that we generated based on the general list of potential changes that I mentioned. Each of the phases are it's actually divided up into three parts. And after the second task, that is when MIPA would like to hear from the town so that they could provide some guidance on what the final document would be. So it is something that's not fully defined, and but we have a good idea about what's likely to be needed based on our conversations with the state.
Thank you. All set? Yeah. Questions from the board, Don?
Not so much of a question, because some of the predications that we use to develop this current plan had what appears to be an egregious error in East Harwich when it's compared to what's actually allowed out there, for growth factor. So I mean, when you're doing that, I just hope that you hold that thought in mind.
Yep, this, I mean, what we would be doing as part of this first part is to make sure it's all properly documented, how, you know, the growth projections and working closely with the town and, you know, having public meetings so everybody's aware of, you know, what's included in that.
But again, the actual zoning that would have been the basis upon which you derive that growth never happened.
Yes. I'm aware of what you're talking about, and yes, we're aware of that as we go through this, yes.
Any further, Don?
Nope.
Larry?
Only to follow up and clarify Don's comment that there was a discussion going on at the time for an East Harwich Village Center, which was added on to what the growth was based on zoning as an outlier, and that somehow has taken the center stage of the number everyone's talking about, because that was showed a 41% growth. But if you look at using the same growth factors based on what would be allowable in zoning, it actually drops down to 14%. So there's a misunderstanding that we've, I guess, not communicated well. But I do agree that needs to be corrected going forward, because there's certainly right now no stomach for that, even though it sounded good at the time, for that village center. So that's an important factor to look into.
Understood.
Mary?
I like the 3 tasks and the subtasks, and I assume once we get started, each of those will have a deliverable date with them.
Correct. At the end, at the final page, we have a
Right.
proposed schedule, so yeah, so that would be correct, yes.
And I think my other question is more for Joe. I note that you don't start until December, and I suspect that's because we need funding through town meeting, is that
You
correct?
nailed it. That's correct.
Okay. So
And you'll see the companion item that comes up next is
Yeah.
discussing whether we want this to come before a special town meeting in October, or if the board wants to talk about it for the spring town meeting.
So I'm assuming you'd be ready to go once we give you the high sign.
As soon as, yes, we are.
Okay,
And it just,
thank you.
Go ahead.
real quick, I just came up to add that the memorandum that you have in your packet is just a draft memorandum. This is not a contractual agreement. So if there are things, tasks, anything that you want to, there's a reason why it says draft. Is because we can definitely add or subtract as needed to, you know, to meet the goals of the project.
Thank you. Joe, anything to add? Oh, Larry, you want something?
Yeah, just process, Mark. Going through the process initially, MIPA, of course, is the final word, but we also worked with the Cape Cod Commission. Do they have a role on the change document as well?
They would, yes, they would. Yeah, Cape Cod Commission would be an entity that would be involved.
So we kind of follow that same process in the changes we did initially. So it's more than just, okay.
Yeah, I
And that's
mentioned-
sequential, or you do it at the same time?
So, I focused on MIPA because
They're the ultimate authority. I got that.
they are, and
yeah.
they're the ones that everybody else gets involved through
Right.
them. Even DEP, who is really the
Part of
entity you're primarily, concerned.
I was just trying to understand.
Yes.
They confused me.
Yes.
Joe, anything to add?
Well, just that we've been talking about segues tonight, so this is I think, the appropriate time to segue into item B2 on the agenda. And that is a discussion by the board whether you wish to take this scope and fee memo and turn it into a potential project. And if so, the project requires appropriation, as was said before. And so we put it on the agenda to give the board the flexibility this evening if you wanted to talk about it for the annual town meeting. But I feel confident looking in Dan's direction and Carol's direction and say that we've talked, so the administrator, the finance director, and the wastewater superintendent. If you remember my memo to you folks a few weeks ago about that special town meeting, this topic was the first bullet point. So this is the primary reason why we're contemplating that special town meeting. And so we need to seek an appropriation to fund the tasks that they've outlined so we can get this underway. And it's the critical next step as we talk about getting deeper into our comprehensive wastewater management plan, modifying it to reflect where we're at and where we want to go. And so the discussion tonight for the board is, shall we do this in October? If you don't decide tonight, that's okay, because it's coming back at your regular meeting next week as a draft article. The other thing that we want to be aware of is, you can see in the memorandum, they've given us a price range. And so we anticipated that $250,000 price range. Carol, Dan, and I continue our weekly wastewater meetings. We'll continue again tomorrow and Tuesday. And so the question now that we're working on is this a project that, if we go forward, is this something that might be eligible for the, I don't even know what the acronym stands for anymore, American Recovery Something Act, ARPA. I'm getting my offstage directions in a moment.
American Rescue Plan Act.
Of course, the American Rescue Plan Act for 2021, that's roughly the something $1 trillion infrastructure. But well within that is infrastructure as it relates to wastewater. So we're trying to validate that, but the question for you tonight is, do you want this to proceed? And if so, do you want us to contemplate it in October town meeting for an appropriation?
I'll start with Mary.
Yes, October.
Don?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I mean, I wouldn't want to vote on any project at all unless I knew what we were building and why we were building it.
Larry?
Go ahead.
Can I get a motion?
I move that we vote to include this topic in the special town meeting, October 18th,
Correct.
2021.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Anyone in the audience? Or Russ?
Real quick item, and that fee that was presented in this memorandum, the range between 200 and 250,000, we'd recommend it being set up as an hourly contract not to exceed, whereas some projects are lump sum, like for example, the sewer cat is 150,000. So that way, if we don't spend 200, we're not gonna bill you 200. It's gonna be the hopefully the lowest possible cost to the town.
I trust that you'll work with Dan and Joe on that contract. Don?
Mr. Chair, I might observe we're not actually debating the actual article right now. We're just instructing that an article be developed to be placed.
Yes.
Clara McClarty. I just wanted to say thanks to Mark and Russ, and I have worried a lot about this, but I have a really good feeling. I like what they laid out, and I appreciate how they communicated it. It is reassuring.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Anyone else? Okay, I'll go to a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, 4-0, Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, if I may, before you proceed to the next topic, I think it's worth noting that the discussion that we just had, both items A and B, and the vote that you just took a moment ago, is a significant milestone. You may recall that acting as your interim town administrator going back to November of 2019, the board at that time was contemplating action at the May 2020 annual town meeting. Long before we were concerned about COVID-19, the coronavirus, long before many of us knew what pandemic really meant. And we, as a town and as administration, struggled with that issue. And as we got through the months of pandemic, we've always contemplated some item to come back before the town in the form of town meeting, and that is this topic tonight. And I think it's significant because if you look at the evolution of where the town was almost 2 years ago to where we are this evening, I don't think it's an understatement to say that there's been radical change, but in a good way. You know, the board has heard, administration has heard from the public, and there were concerns over those last 18 to 24 months. So this evening's vote and this evening's update, I think, it should be recognized for the milestone that it is. Having said that, we'll take a brief pause, pat ourselves on the back, and then get ready to get it passed through town meeting in October.
Thank you.
But I would be remiss if I didn't make those statements.
Thank you, Joe. Next on the agenda is an update from Pleasant Bay Alliance on the watershed permit status and watershed modeling. Carol,
Good evening.
welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here. And for the record, my name is Carol Ridley, a coordinator for the Pleasant Bay Alliance. And for those who may not be familiar with the Alliance was formed by the towns of Harwich, Chatham, Brewster, and Orleans back in 1998. And we oversee a resource management plan for the Pleasant Bay watershed. And a major focus of our work over the past 20-plus years has been this issue of nutrient pollution in Pleasant Bay. So tonight, here to talk with you about the status of our work under the Pleasant Bay Watershed Permit, and also some implementation support that we have received grants for from the Southern New England Estuaries program, which is a program of, it's a Southern New England program, watershed grant program, which is a program of US EPA, which is administered by Restore America's Estuaries. And I just want to note that I'm joined here this evening by Alan Thompson, who is your appointed member of the steering committee, along with Dorothy Howell, and also Mike Giggy with Wright Pierce. And Wright Pierce is a technical consultant to the Pleasant Bay Alliance. So all of the work that I'm going to be sharing with you this evening is really the product of a lot of input and is managed through our watershed work group. Dan Pelletier and Heinz Proft are active participants in that effort, and the folks from GHD have been participating as well more recently. Some of you attend those meetings from time to time. We have their counterparts, technical consultants, and the staff who are managing the wastewater programs in our respective member towns participating in that effort. So I just want to let you know that we have a pretty deep bench, a lot of great input into this process. So our objectives for today, okay, there we go, thank you. So we're going to report to you some progress on the watershed permit. In your packet, you would have had a copy of the most recent annual report that was submitted to DEP and to the Cape Cod Commission. DEP is the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. And we're also going to be discussing some findings from some of the watershed grant implementation support that includes some work on non-traditional technologies, but perhaps more important for our discussion this evening, the update of the Massachusetts Estuaries, or MEP model that was used. It's sort of the underpinning science, for all of the town's comprehensive plans. And then we're going to talk about some next steps and some ideas for additional analysis to support the decisions that are before this board and the community. That's our focus. Our focus is to generate the science and analysis that really contributes to the discussion in each of our member towns, and also achieves our cleanup of Pleasant Bay as efficiently as possible. We do have an additional a little over $100,000 grant from the Southern New England program for some additional modeling. So part of what we're looking for in this process, and we're working very closely with Dan and GHD on this, is to hone in on the kinds of questions that will help Harwich in that modeling effort. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so just a little bit of background on the Pleasant Bay Watershed Permit. So Harwich and the member towns received the very first watershed permit issued in the Commonwealth back in 2018 for the purpose of removing excessive nutrient watershed load to clean up an abatement. So this is a 20-year permit. It is structured in 5-year increments, and that's intended to provide check-in points so that towns can make adjustments to their plans, and we're talking about some of those adjustments already in all of our member towns. And there's a tremendous amount of benefits that our member communities receive by participating in this watershed permit. Everything from having clarity about how the town will get credit for the actions it undertakes to clean up the nitrogen pollution. Also, Massachusetts DEP enforcement forbearance, as long as the towns are following the approved plan. There will not be any enforcement orders necessarily imposed on the towns for the overloading of nitrogen in the waterways. Some priority for receiving SRF funding, and also just the assurance that the other towns you share the watershed with are doing their part. Everybody is kicking in and doing their part. Pointing us in the right direction. Thank you, Jamie.
You can just say slide out.
Okay, terrific, thank you. So this is sort of the core of the nitrogen, of the targeted watershed management plan, which spells out the responsibility each town has for removing nitrogen load from the watershed. Overall, we have a need to remove 17,700 kilograms per year. That's system-wide. And you can see the breakout by each town. And I want to note that those numbers, so Harwich is listed there as being responsible for 4,400 kilograms per year removal, which is about 25% of that total. All of those numbers come from the towns. So we worked very closely, Wright Pierce helped us pull this all together, working very closely with each town's staff and technical consultants. So those aren't our numbers, those are the town's numbers also. But a couple of things about these numbers. One is they are sort of big picture numbers. They don't necessarily, they're based on, first of all, existing load, so they don't factor in new growth and new load from new development. Also, they don't, we're going to get into finer detail about within each community there are sub-watersheds that have reduction targets. So that's another consideration. They're based on the 2006 Estuaries project report, which is based on 2004, 2005 data. So part of what we're talking about this evening is the update of that and the implications of that new model information. And just to point out that beyond, because this is existing load represented in these figures, any new development that leads to new nitrogen load, 100% of that needs to be removed in order for the targets to be achieved. So those are our targets, but there are a lot of facets that we need to bear in mind as we look at those numbers. So this table shares basically how each of the towns is proposing to achieve their reductions over the life of the permit. So you can see on the left-hand column the different 5-year increments, and each community is proposing in different paces their proposed reduction. So Harwich is one of our early hitters. I mean, there's a lot of nitrogen being removed in the early years from work Harwich is doing on the East Harwich sewers. The 2,872 kilograms per year, which is showing up at the end of year 5, which is 2023, that represents all of phase 2 sewering plus 200 kilograms per year for the new fertilizer bylaw. So in years 6 to 10, that 1,565 kilograms per year reflects had been proposed for phase 3 sewers. And then all the way down after year 20, 103 kilograms per year, which is phase 8, I believe, and that is gets you to the total. So that's Harwich's, based on the targeted watershed management plan, which is the permit at this point. But already towns are making changes, and that's to be expected. That's not, problematic. It just means new information is coming forward. Towns who are working with non-traditional technologies are learning more. So that is to be expected, but that is happening. So we're trying to keep ahead of that. And so in the annual report in your packet that was just submitted, and there's an annual report required every year under the watershed permit, I'm going to point your attention to the middle bar, because that represents where we are at the end of August 2021, which is basically when that third year report was submitted. And we're doing well. That dotted line, just under 5,000, that's our 5-year target. And so we're making our way. And that shaded area where the 1422 is shown in that bar, that's the phase 2 sewer work that's already been constructed. And a decision was made, even though those sewers aren't connected, we're not technically pumping the wastewater yet and removing the nitrogen yet, but the towns have been given credit toward that work because you've made the investment. I mean, it's going to happen. It's a matter of time. So the decision was made, and DEP accepted to include that in the total for the year 3 report. If you look to the right, and all of the phase 2 sewer is completed, and all of the other towns do what they are proposing to do, you can see we exceed the 5-year mark at the end of 2023. So, I think that's an encouraging sign that the towns are making progress toward the targets outlined in the watershed permit. But I want to note a couple of things. One is that the towns, as I said, are looking at modifications to their plans. Harwich is considering them as well. So we really need to understand what those changes are and how they factor into the overall performance. And again, we're not looking at a sub-watershed basis here. So are we meeting the targets we need to meet in each of our sub-watersheds? That's another question, and I think we're going to hear more from Dan about that later on. And this does not include any of the information we just generated through that grant-funded work that I spoke of, and we're going to move on to that now. So this is just based on the existing model, the 2006 and updated in 2010 MEP model. That's the basis for these numbers that were reported in the 2021 annual report. The new information I'm going to share in a minute, we had just received at the end of June. There was not enough time to assimilate that and factor that into this report. So that will be an ongoing process. So I just want to touch on, we've been doing a lot of work under the Southern New England program funding. We received a grant of $250,000 back in 2018. And there are some very interesting studies and findings on our website if you want to dive into the details on any of these topics. So the first bullet is a municipal denitrifying septic system program, or you heard the term innovative alternative earlier, IA. That's basically what that is. These are on-site systems that remove more nitrogen than a typical Title V system. And Brewster was very interested in using a municipally operated denitrifying septic system program requiring certain properties within their portion of the Pleasant Bay watershed to use these systems to take care of part of their load removal responsibility. So we did this pilot study to see what that might look like. What we found in this instance was that there weren't enough DEP-approved technologies to achieve the removals Brewster needed. That bumped up the cost because there were more monitoring requirements. And so it made it a little bit infeasible at the moment. I think the town has put that idea, it's not off the table, but I think they put it in the background a little bit, and they're looking at other alternatives at this point. But a lot of really good information and analysis went into that study. So anyone who's interested in innovative alternative or denitrifying septic systems, I urge you to go to our website and look that up. We also did some work in support of the Lonnie's Pond Shellfish Aquaculture Program, which is for the town of Orleans. They are removing part of their nitrogen in the Lonnie's Pond sub-watershed using oyster aquaculture. It's working, but we learned that there's some issues with scaling that up to a level that would be needed or replicated in other parts of town. But again, interesting information. We have a nitrogen trading study that is nearing completion. This is looking at, I think there was a reference earlier to if a community has additional capacity, storing capacity, for example, that they don't need, and a neighboring town sharing a sub-watershed is looking for a way to address their share of the load, say Brewster in this instance, nitrogen trading is one possibility. So that's, we're just framing out the concepts of what a program might look like, what some of the considerations are, how it could be structured, but it certainly is a tool available to Harwich and the other member towns. And for probably of greatest interest this evening is the update of the Massachusetts Estuaries Project Linked Model, which is the, next slide please, Jamie, thank you. So this model, as I mentioned, basically is what's underpinning all of the comprehensive wastewater management plans in all of the towns on Cape Cod. And it was the basis for establishing the total maximum daily loads that we're all striving to achieve. Now, why was it updated? It was updated because, as I mentioned, the first version of this was 2006. Since that time, we have a new inlet. So we have changes in hydrodynamics in the system. We have a lot new water quality data that needed to be incorporated. There's been more watershed development and increases in load. And there was new sampling of the sediment regeneration. So one source of nitrogen is from the bottom sediments of an estuary kind of bubbling up into the system, and we have new data on that information as well. So we have, as a result of this model update, much better information for the towns to use to assess all of the new ideas that will come up through the CWMP revision. We will have now an updated model to look at all of those alternatives, and so better information for guiding decision making. We did use the model. We had a limited amount of funding to actually run some scenarios with the updated model, and we looked at the town strategies as they are outlined in the Targeted Watershed Management Plan or Watershed Permit, and also some strategies based on some of the modifications that have already been made by some of the towns since the Watershed Permit in 2018. And I just want to share a table. This is just a quick summary. So in the left-hand column, there's SMAS 2006-2010. That's basically the baseline we used in our in the comprehensive management plans and the targeted watershed management plan. The two columns to the right, the one to the far right is the targeted watershed management plan. So that's the watershed permit. And just, you know, it's a lot of information, but at the bottom, you can see the primary and secondary stations. The whole gist of this effort is to achieve nitrogen concentrations in the water column, in the water we monitor, at a certain level at certain stations that are located throughout the bay. With the targeted watershed management plan and the new model, we make 7 of the 8 stations. So that's pretty good. Not quite there, need a little tweaking, but 7 of the 8 stations comply with some of the changes the towns are considering right now, and some of that is a little bit of a gap in some of the reductions that are needed. We're down to 6 out of 8, so not so great. But again, these are all adjustments to be made, nothing to be alarmed about, but just this is good information to help our towns refine their plans. So I want to talk about a couple of things that are really significant for Harwich this evening, because I mean, essentially, we found in this process that, you know, there's more watershed load in the watershed, Pleasant Bay wide, but there's increased flushing, so that has sort of balanced that out. But the new attenuation factors, I think you've probably heard about from Dan and others, are of most concern perhaps to Harwich and to Brewster. We found 2 areas in the system where attenuation rates change significantly, and this has direct bearing on what the town's credit would be for the nitrogen management actions you propose. So attenuation is actually the uptake of nitrogen from water. So freshwater systems take up nitrogen. So as groundwater flows through or under a freshwater system, that nitrogen, a part of it will go up into the freshwater system, and it won't make its way into the bay. Muddy Creek, when the bridge was built, salt water came in. So rather than being a kind of a freshwater system in the upper portion, it became saltier. It's actually quite salty at this point. That means it doesn't act like a freshwater system, and it doesn't attenuate nitrogen. It doesn't take it up. So what does that mean for the town? Before, the town wouldn't get credit for nitrogen removal that otherwise would have been taken up by the natural system. So you didn't get credit for the nitrogen removal that was attenuating in Upper Muddy Creek. Now that that attenuation is gone, you get credit for it, because if the sewers weren't there, the water would be flowing through and getting its way to the creek. So that sounds like a good deal for Harwich. It's actually the opposite direction for Brewster. They have an attenuation factor that went up, not down. So it has the reverse effect for them. So there are some sort of initial thoughts about this, and I know Dan is going to touch on this, but it's definitely a topic that deserves more attention and more study. We want to really understand the implications of this. I've given you a very probably general description of this, but there's a lot more to it, and because of the significance of this new information and the millions of dollars potentially it can mean for our communities, we want to make sure we give you the best information possible. So we have identified some additional steps we are going to take as the Alliance to take a closer look at those attenuation factors, double checking them, looking at all the other implications of that information, and we will be reporting back to you on that. But in the meantime, it does provide some interesting information for the town to act on at this point. And so in terms of Harwich and where you are in this process, as we pointed out before, let me just use the pointer. So maybe I won't use the pointer. Doesn't work. Okay. Well, anyway, you know, Harwich may be getting a little bit, this is showing you as having about 1,622 kilograms per year of removal at the end of this year, basically, at the end of this annual report that was just issued. That number may be higher, all right, because of the attenuation. It could be quite high, actually. It could be your entire year 5 limit or requirement. So that's requiring further study. But it does, I think, give the town the opportunity to take another look at that third contract in phase 2 and think about how you might want to retool that. Because the other thing that's become clear in this is that the town has over-removed the nitrogen it needs to remove from Upper Muddy Creek subwatershed, which is one of the 4 in Harwich's share of Pleasant Bay. And so that was true under the old numbers, but it's even more true under the new attenuation numbers. So that is something to consider as you go forward. So just to start summing things up here, things are on track, but you know there's the potential for some, so there's a potential that you have met your year 5 target early, but that's a gross target that doesn't look at the individual 4 subwatersheds. So I think that's the key point, and I think Dan is going to get into a little bit more detail on that. But again, it does give you that opportunity to check the year 3 contract, but consider how to address the over-removal in Muddy Creek, ensure that you're meeting thresholds in all 4 of the subwatersheds. So that would be Upper and Lower Muddy Creek, Round Cove, and Pleasant Bay. And then the question of growth is a big one, and how that's factored in so that we can be sure that projected growth in development and therefore nitrogen load is going to be amply taken care of and not kick you out of compliance with the total maximum daily loads. So that's another factor for consideration. So we've identified these bullet points, working with Dan and his team, to take a close look at the nitrogen removal that's actually going to happen once those sewers get connected in contracts 1 and 2 of phase 2, and to take another look at the year 3 contract to deal with the revised attenuation in Muddy Creek. And there may be some modeling that we can do there to help clarify the impact of some of the options you may be considering, looking at growth, and then there's the option of nitrogen trading depending upon what type of excess capacity may be in your picture. So I will stop there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great job, Carol. Thank you for the update. Larry?
Good presentation, Carol. As usual, you created a lot of interesting data that we have to, and I do appreciate, I know in one of your previous meetings, I raised the issue of attenuation because that caught me by surprise. You expect a little bit change, but not this. So I look forward to a better understanding that and then the implications, but just, well, what you say, it'd be good to know more.
Definitely have to take a closer look at that. Yeah.
Thank you, Carol. Mary?
Can you just explain a little bit about nitrogen trading? Is that cash for nitrogen removal between towns? How's that work?
Mike, do you want to? Mike Giggy is actually leading that study, so if he can probably give you a much better summary than I can.
Part of my work early on was to look at the 4 comprehensive wastewater management plans, and it became clear that there's a lot of differences in the assumptions and expectations with respect to nitrogen removal. Among the 4 towns, there are 7 different technologies proposed in 11 different projects. So I took each of the 7 technologies and tried to come up with a cost, an all-in cost, a first cost, an annual cost, to find out what each pound of nitrogen or each kilogram of nitrogen would cost. And I found a broad range, as low as $300 to $400 a pound in towns like Harwich or the Sewering, and as much as $700 or $750 a pound in towns that are looking at some of the non-traditional technologies. So there's very little interaction among the towns to compare notes and see whether they could help one another. So the theory here is that if a town could do more of the low-cost technology on behalf of another town that would do less of the high-cost technology, there'd be some net savings. And so if towns could cooperate, there might be a lower overall cost, savings to the buyer of those credits, and an income to the towns like Harwich that might be on the selling side of that equation.
And we're talking cash, we're talking real money, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Is that all, Mary? All set?
I think so.
Okay. Don?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm going to go a little bit different direction and just briefly want to remind everybody who's listening to all this, I'm extremely grateful that this alliance was formed in the late 90s, and we've got 2 of the people here between Alan and Carol who've been there. This is the framework so that the public understands this. This is more than a generation of hard work that's gone into this. This is allowing us to have an intelligent discussion because we already have something in place to be able to do that.
Thank you. Still all set, Mary?
All set, thank you.
Joe, do you want to add anything?
Nothing at this time.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol.
Great, thank you very much.
Oh, we got one from the audience.
Mark Kelleher, Harwich. Thank you, Carol. There's an overwash opposite on North Beach, opposite Chatham Bars Inn. If that becomes a break, how soon would that additional flushing out of Pleasant Bay be reflected in your figures? And is it a viable option that would really have a positive effect on the Pleasant Bay nitrogen levels?
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I mean, all of those changes, those natural changes in the hydrodynamics have an impact. What we're finding, and actually, if you do go to our website and look at the report, the updated model report, there's a whole section on hydrodynamics, which might be of interest to you or anyone interested in the changes that have already happened. One of the things we're learning is that the system is now, sort of the northern part of the system is more dependent on the 2007 break, and less of the exchange is happening in that southern portion through Chatham Harbor than used to be the case. So it's really impossible for me to predict what the implication of that would be. There would be some, but I can tell you that the 2007 inlet is becoming the dominant inlet in terms of the upper portion of the system. So I don't know if that helps. Thanks.
Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, again, Patrick Ott in East Harwich. Again, I'm curious, changes that you are recommending or suggesting, how do they occur? Does that mean we have to go back to the Cwmp and make changes there? How do the recommendations you propose happen?
So that's a great question, and I guess our model is really a collaborative one. So we work, I say we, I mean, Dan is a part of our regular conversations about this. All of our towns are. So it's sort of a process of sharing information, getting new science, and presenting that to the communities, and really then it's up to the communities to make the decisions. Ultimately, you decide what happens with the plan. But I mean, we make recommendations based on that science, and then that enters the conversation and the local process. So I think that in this instance, this science and this information will feed very nicely into the update of the comprehensive wastewater management plan. And that will have a whole public process around it, town meeting, et cetera, and that's how that will happen. Thank you, Patrick.
All set? Moving on to the next.
Thank you.
The update from our water wastewater superintendent, Dan Pelletier. Jamie, I'll give you as much time as you want.
The batteries are still It's not going to work.
Joe, before Dan gets started, do you want to make any announcements?
Sure, just that if you get a sense that there's a rhythm or a logic to the agenda, there is. However, it was because of our wastewater superintendent. Meaning you've heard from the engineers, you've heard from the groups, the alliances that have worked on all this. So what Dan's about to present is, as we said earlier and to an earlier question, now what and what next? And so Dan's presentation, I think, is going to go a long way towards, sorry to put the pressure on you, on your 35th birthday, by the way. I told you I'd get it in there. It's his birthday, and this is how he celebrates it.
And town meeting's on my wedding anniversary, so.
We'll all sing later.
You're welcome, or I'm sorry, however that may be. But you know, what you'll hear from Dan is where we go from here. And again, from my remarks earlier, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that, you know, where we were 2 years ago or even 18 months ago is radically different than where we are today. And I think we've approached it, we being the town, the board, administration, staff, everybody involved, to step back from where we were 18 months ago, pump the brakes a little bit, and again, if there was an upshoot, no, there is no upshoot to pandemic, but at least being able to leverage that stoppage of time, if you will, we're in a much better place with information and next steps. So with that, I will shut up and turn it over to our superintendent.
Thank you, Joe.
So before I get going into recommendations, I just want to give kind of a quick public service announcement to those residents out in East Harwich who were sewered under contracts 1 and 2. I have been getting a handful of calls as to what's going on, where are we at. So I actually have this Wednesday a substantial completion walkthrough for construction contract 1. That was Robert Hour's contract. That was mostly 39 and 137. So once we get past substantial completion, the next hurdle for us to have customers come online, the Board of Health is currently working on a sewer connection regulation. The reason that's important is because in order to be eligible for the up to $6,000 tax credit, residents have to be mandated to connect to the sewer. So they're working on that sewer connection regulation so that when the letters go out, residents will be able to file and get that $6,000 tax credit. The tax credit, just for those who know, it is 50 or 40% of the cost to connect to the sewer system, up to $6,000. So if you're spending a total of 15, you could get a tax credit up to 6,000. So we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to take advantage of that. There are a couple houses and properties in East Harwich that are under a mandate already from the Board of Health, or they are otherwise new construction and would not be eligible for the tax credit. I have made contact with a number of builders. I'm working on getting a list from the health department so that we could get those people online. We could get the new construction occupancy permits and the failed systems connected up. But for those who are not under order, I would recommend waiting so you can take advantage of the tax credit. With the orders to connect, we'll be mailing out an order to connect package. We plan on including in that the stub card that you would provide to your registered sanitarian or engineer to complete the design of your sewer service. We're going to be sending out kind of the do's and don'ts of sewer, the list of approved installers, the registered sanitarians and engineers. So we're trying to get you everything that you will need as a new sewer customer to get hooked up. I guess with that, I will jump into the slides. So the last time, if I'm not mistaken, the board was here to discuss DHY. The board was reaffirming their commitment.
Let me pause you for 1 second. Anyone in the audience have any questions about hookups for the current system that's already designed? Go ahead, Dan.
All right. So I think the last time we were here, the board was reaffirming their commitment to continue discussions with respect to DHY. Since that time, I think it's important to call attention to the August 3rd Cape Cod Times article stating that Yarmouth was intending on moving forward on their own to construct a wastewater treatment plant. That treatment plant is proposed to be on Buck Island Road, which makes it considerably less feasible for Harwich to send our effluent to a DHY plant in Yarmouth. So that being the case, it makes DHY, as we've been discussing, a rather moot point. However, I think it's important to note that there's still a regional solution or option available with Dennis. Now, The town of Dennis is still currently working on their CWMP, and they're not quite ready to put a bucket in the ground for a treatment plant or collection system. So we do still have a little time on that front. That being said, this all does allow us to refocus our efforts on East Harwich and our obligation to remove nitrogen through the Targeted Watershed Management Plan. So, slide. So on the screen, and this is going to look very similar to one that slide that Carol had as well, but this is the actual implementation schedule from our watershed permit with the Alliance. You can see on the schedule, as Carol also pointed out, we're looking to remove 2,672 kilograms per year by 2023, an additional 1,565 kilograms per year by 2028. What the implementation schedule doesn't show is exactly where the removal needs to occur, which is a really important component to the success of our wastewater management plan. Slide. So to better answer the question of where, we need to look at Table 2 in the Targeted Watershed Management Plan. So in the bottom right of the screen, the red is kind of washed out, but in the Harwich column, we're looking again at that 4,399 or 4,400 kilograms per year that Harwich needs to remove. Now we got to look at that figure as that we're looking at this from 30,000 feet, because that 4,400 kilograms reflects what we need to remove in the image on the left on the screen. What it doesn't identify is, or show, is that that removal is actually distributed across 4 individual watersheds. So we're looking at removing just over 1,200 in Round Cove, 584 in Upper Muddy Creek, 986 in Lower Muddy Creek, and 1620 in Pleasant Bay. So one important thing to also note is how much we need to sewer to hit these numbers, and as Carol alluded to, that is taking into account our nitrogen attenuation rates. Slide. So to demonstrate how the nitrogen attenuation rates can impact our sewering program, we can look first at contracts 1 and 2 and compare our estimated removal back to our Targeted Watershed Management Plan. So had the attenuation rates remained as they were in 2010, we would have landed just shy of our required removal in Lower Muddy Creek and just almost double our removal in Upper Muddy Creek. Now you can see with looking at the 2021 attenuation rates that we've just about hit the mark in Lower Muddy Creek, removing about 983 kilograms per year against our required 986, and over-sewered Upper Muddy Creek, having removed 1,769 kilograms of a required 584. Now, it's really important to note that attenuations can change, as we saw from 2010 to 2021. And I think it's important to point out that this time they changed for the better. And it is possible that in the future they could change such that we're going back to an area we're sewered and have to do more work if attenuations change for the negative. Slide. So, acknowledging that Upper and Lower Muddy Creek subwatersheds are pretty well taken care of, we can now focus our efforts on the remaining watersheds, which is Pleasant Bay and Round Cove, and look to do those in the most efficient and cost-effective way possible. So using the attenuation rates and best available data, it suggests that we need to remove approximately 47,000 gallons per day in the Pleasant Bay subwatershed and 34,000 gallons per day in this Round Cove subwatershed, and that's to meet our baseline nitrogen removal requirements in the Cwmp. It's my opinion I think we should move quickly to develop a new partial Phase 3, and I think that's in the town's best interest because with the passage of a pending $1 trillion infrastructure bill, Harwich would be best served to have a shovel-ready project on the shelf when that funding gets distributed. Expansion beyond baseline nitrogen removal can be captured in a later phase after growth projections have been revised through the Notice of Project Change process. When considering a new Phase 3, we also need to consider properties that were removed from Phase 2. For example, Bascom Hollow is presently under an order from the Board of Health to install IA systems at all properties in that neighborhood if they don't connect to the sewer. If you're not aware, there's a sewer main at the new fire station out in East Harwich, just shy of Bascom Hollow. And it would be my opinion that that would be a shame to see them invest in IA systems for that neighborhood when we have a sewer pipe right up the street. Furthermore, I think it's important to draw attention to Continental and WITA and the Homeowners Association, who at the but when the town told them that sewers are coming, they took it upon themselves to get engineering plans and get themselves set up for what the town told them was coming. And unfortunately, due to the bid overrun, those two streets were removed, and they have since spent, $40,000 on engineering. I believe that we, as the town, have to make them whole in one way or another. Personally, I think that could be either through sewering that neighborhood or through reimbursing the association. Sewering that neighborhood would result in more sewering in a watershed that we don't need to continue sewering in. So that's really the struggle that the board has to weigh. The Upper Muddy Creek watershed, we've removed 1,700 kilograms out of a required 580 or so. So even with growth, I believe that, and I'm confident saying that we're covered in Upper Muddy Creek, but again, I think it's important we make them whole. So again, I guess I'll reiterate, so my recommendation for Harwich is to develop plans to meet baseline nitrogen removal in the Pleasant Bay and Round Cove subwatersheds. I would recommend appropriating design money at a special town meeting this fall due to the infrastructure bill passing. I make a recommendation to the town. I look at it from a number of perspectives, and if the infrastructure bill wasn't on the horizon, I would suggest waiting and taking our time with it. But the fact that there is $1 trillion slated, I think that it would be a worthwhile investment to develop plans for nitrogen we know we need to mitigate for a phase that ultimately would serve the town. Furthermore, I think it's also important that the town consider formally putting a dry pipe on Route 28. So the Water Department is currently working on a water main project from Lower County Road to the Dennistown line. Mass DOT is planning to pave 28 from the Dennistown line to the Herring River Bridge. There's going to be a 5-year road cut moratorium, and ultimately, if we don't get that backbone down there, we're locked out of doing anything west of the Herring River until we can cut the road again. I think that we should continue discussions with Dennis on a regional solution and look to draft an IMA with Dennis on that front, while also looking to utilize the full capacity that we've purchased in Chatham. I think it's an important statement to make that the capacity we purchased in Chatham is the cheapest we are going to get any gallon of wastewater treated. If not purely because of inflation since the time that deal took place, I think that we should be looking to maximize everything we can there. Upon wrapping up with the notice of project change and new growth estimates, we can determine what surplus capacity we have in that agreement, and we could look to either request Chatham accept wastewater flows from a different watershed in town, or we could seek to use that for a nitrogen trading opportunity with Brewster or another watershed town that we share. I think that kind of comes to the end of it. And I guess I would look to you if you have any questions on that.
Thank you, Dan. I'll start with questions from the board. Larry?
Thank you, Dan. I guess I have more of a question than more of a comment than a question. Working with Dennis, it seemed to emphasize an IMA. And I think, Russ, you mentioned this briefly, but broadly speaking, I look at two options of working together. One's a regional plan and one's an IMA. And I know there's various forms of IMAs, but I look kind of regional as being the opportunity to sit at the table when it's being formed versus an IMA, which oftentimes is looked at sort of one town being a host city and the other one buying into that. And I'd rather be on the front end of that and not have to pay maybe impact fees or because that gives us more control over where we're going than we're going after the fact. So I just would like to broaden that statement to say we look at it both ways, IMA and a regional approach. If my basic brief description is correct. I'd like to have more. I'd like to have more of a say at how we go forward.
Yeah, and I think just on that topic, I guess a couple things to discuss. You know, there is a difference between Harwich's plan and Dennis's plan. I think that may make, well, it's not going to make a regionalization difficult, but it could make the conversation interesting. So Harwich, and how I base my recommendations is that, you know, I started in 2016 right after the Hawks Nest town meeting article failed, and I'm very sensitive to the fact that we have said, Harwich has said, and I have acted on this statement, that Harwich is sewering for, not for economic purposes, but to remove the nitrogen to satisfy the TMDLs. I believe that Dennis is looking at this from an entirely different perspective, where they are seeking for economic growth. And one of the things that I guess that could cause conflict when we're talking about what we're going to build. If they're going to build something much bigger to handle a larger economic growth, we may not want to be necessarily partners in that, but instead of a paying customer. But ultimately, that decision lies with the board, and I would defer to your direction as a board.
Michael, if I may, one other comment. I do appreciate using existing flows in your diagram and how you're going forward. I do think that if we're looking at least a minimal sense, I do still think that using what we can do with current zoning, not building beyond that, but with current zoning is a way to be sure we're planning not for growth in these crazy, excuse me for saying that, let me restate that, not for maybe extensive large developments, but for more moderate growth. That was implied in our zoning, by the way. I would like to see those being taken into account when we look at flows, when we get into these discussions.
That's fair, and I think just one, I guess, point for East Harwich is that, and I was talking to Carol about this earlier, and we talked about growth in the watershed and kind of what, at least in the short term. And if you look at the parcel map, the developed areas in Round Cove and Pleasant Bay, which I guess would be kind of the northern section of the Pleasant Bay watershed, I'm not sure that there is the room for growth that we had in upper and lower Muddy Creek subwatersheds. I mean, if you look at the Google Maps aerial, you can see we have Hawks Nest, we have the big swath of land behind, on either side, Hall's Path and the other side, that would have been where a lot of potential growth, I guess, could have occurred. And I think we lose that as we get into the more northern portion. But again,
that's
I would
the
be looking at the
reevaluation
board
we
for,
need to do now. I
Yeah.
mean, that's why it's a living document. We need to do that. My point is I would not like to tie our hands and say there's going to be no growth in flow.
Yeah. And we have to plan for growth.
Yeah.
There is growth. There are undeveloped parcels in East Harwich that are currently developable. We certainly can't forget about them. So I'm with you.
That's enough for me.
Yes, sir. Mary?
I like your recommended next steps, Dan. Just a couple of questions. How receptive do you think Chatham would be? I wasn't aware that it was specific to 2 watersheds.
So I had asked that question a couple weeks ago, and it's not a no. It is a conversation that needs to be had, is really kind of how they left it. I informed them that I would be looking to make that recommendation and bring it back to the table with Chatham to have a more hearty discussion. But my understanding is that when the IMA was developed between Harwich and Chatham, there was a lot of debate about where the wastewater flows would be coming. Primarily, it was decided Pleasant Bay, and then they did allow also the Great Sand Lakes. And in my discussions with them recently, they said that they would just want to bring that back to either the selectmen, townspeople, to have a bigger discussion about it.
Is it possible that we could take care of Continental and Witta with Chatham?
We certainly have the capacity with what we've purchased in Chatham to handle the flows from Continental and Witta. Continental and Witta, really, in my opinion, it wouldn't require a pump station. There's gravity sewers on both sides of the street. To get them in wouldn't be a massive undertaking, though it would technically not be required per the targeted watershed permit.
Thank you.
If I could just follow up on that question, as Dan has mentioned, you'll recall, at your meeting on August 23rd, you voted amendment number 1 to the Chatham-Harwich intermunicipal agreement as it relates to wastewater. As we shared with the board, the Chatham Select Board voted 4-1 Tuesday evening to agree to that amendment. That was the result of the IMA work group that Dan, Larry, and I are a part of. And so when we first broached this topic, what they said is, let's get through amendment number 1. They knew that we were having this meeting tonight, and so we'll be able to reach out to Chatham to initiate that conversation, if that's the board's will going forward, as early as next week. So they're receptive to a conversation, I think, is the best way to categorize their response.
All set.
All set, thanks.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My comments, first of all, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Joe. Wherever Griff is at this point, thank
Brewster.
him. Yeah, that other town. But this is a really professional look at this as compared to what I saw like 4 or 5 years ago. There was some broad political consensus. That is my first comment. Words like partnership and control have a meaning to people who are sitting in the audience and taxpayers in general. And partners, most people feel like, well, it's a give and take and we can discuss things. And control, most people are thinking that, well, if we don't like what's going on, we can go to a town meeting and tell them, come up with something different. The approach we were talking about for the, to come up with a DHY in its prior context was not any of those things. It was creating a new entity where at the onset, once it got created, no longer allowed any towns, even the Board of Selectmen in each town, to give an opinion on anything. It was being run by its own board. So in that respect, nobody in the general public was going to control anything. It was going to be much like the MWRP or the Port Authority or anything that most people are familiar with that are kind of dark, opaque places where you don't really control them. They have their own board. If we could come up with a regional approach where we have something that's more analogous to the school districts, where there's some direct impact, where people can actually get together and each year say, I like this, but I don't like that, I'd be willing to look into that myself. That was the whole hang-up, is we couldn't come to a conclusion about how this thing would work once we set it off on its own, because it literally was being set off on its own once it happened.
I did suggest when we were talking several years ago, with respect to DHY and hearing that Harwich and many residents expressed concern about giving up that control and ultimately creating a sewer district, which is what we were doing. And, we could have had an annual district meeting just like the Dennis Water District does, for example. Their water system is independent of their town government, and they have their own district meeting. The sewer could do, as you were saying, they could have a district meeting where Harwich and Dennis residents could come and discuss all things DH sewer. When we talk about a regional plan with Dennis too, I think it's important to just, in East Harwich and how it all fits together. Now, when we were discussing DHY for many years, the Gantt chart, which the big schedule of how it's all going to unfold, cited a 2-year design period and a 2-year construction period for the treatment plant. That puts us 4 years from the vote to move forward to get anything done. And that's partly why I'm trying to focus on East Harwich and making as much progress as we can there, because assuming Dennis is 5 years out from being able to accept wastewater flows, this gives us an opportunity to really secure things in East Harwich and then start to transition our efforts either to Herring River, Harwich Center, wherever we decide to go next.
Thank you. Just to end that, and then there's another question. That is not what DHY was. There was no place within that agreement for an annual meeting where the public could come and give their opinion. I fought pretty hard to get codified into the agreement that the boards of selectmen would have to approve the budget each year, but that's the only amount of public input that was afforded after this thing got, matter of fact, they could amend the actual agreement by votes of the commission themselves without any recourse. None of the boards of selectmen or the town meetings would have had any impact whatsoever on that. So I just want to put that to bed, because we're talking about the same pipes, the same possible process. And Larry, I would agree with Larry, we could still have those discussions, but it really should be based on what we exercise every day here, our democracy, where people are involved in the decisions that have to do with their own lives. And that's what was not what was occurring. Now, secondarily, you're talking about the need to clean up in a particular area. My heart kind of breaks for that community, because the prior administration did not nip in the bud these letters that were coming out from a private engineer saying, get in on the beginning of this thing. If you get together, you can hire me and I'll plan out your hookups. There was no pushback on the part of the administration saying, well, hold on, we don't need to do that yet. We're nowhere near that yet. So people spent money. I know they spent money. The question that I have in my mind is, so you can get a direct comparison, how much would it cost to complete the sewering of those areas versus buying out the expense that they have already laid out?
I have had every intention of putting that figure together. I just haven't had the opportunity to do it yet. But what I can tell you on the back of the napkin is it would be millions less to pay them back the 40 they've invested.
Because I'm looking at making real progress in a real problem that we have all across town, not in pacifying any particular neighborhood, because it wasn't fair.
Right.
And we may be, if you can come up with those numbers, we may, as a board, decide it's cheaper to do that and then have shovel-ready projects when this money is coming down from Washington, and do something really substantive that's going to help the community.
Right.
We also have to look at the IAs versus a sewer system. We're going to remove more nitrogen with the sewer system than we're going to remove with the IAs. So I think that that's an important note. Dan, before I go, Joe, you had a comment.
Just two things very quickly, Mr. Chairman. To the earlier discussion about the Dennis Harwich Yarmouth partnership and the subgroup that worked on that, the last official meeting that entity had was Friday, June 18th of this year. And at that meeting, I had said to my counterparts, the Yarmouth manager and the Dennis administrator, and I might have those roles reversed, but respectively, Bob and Liz, that I would report back to my board, and as we did our process, such as tonight, I would certainly keep the lines of communication open. I say that, however, because what Dan has referenced and what we're talking about right now is a concept that exists in Harwich. We have not had any official conversations with the town of Dennis on this, but stand ready to have any conversations that the board deems advisable. And that's quite simply how we left it back in June. And then with regard to the neighborhoods that we just talked about, and you mentioned Griffin Ryder, our former town engineer, and I talked about a year ago where the group of four, I've got to come up with a better name, but was Dan, myself, Carol, and Griffin. We were meeting regularly, and Carol, Dan, and I still meet regularly to talk about wastewater issues. And Dan and I had a conversation over a year ago in the parking lot about any number of solutions that we might be able to offer to potentially make those neighborhoods, I don't know that we can say that we can make them whole, but we can certainly try to divine some idea and some process that helps alleviate a situation that they were not responsible for. So we continue to work on that, and we can come back with any number of workshop ideas if the board wants us to.
Thank you. Dan, I appreciate the direction you're going and the recommendation you made. I've said it from the beginning. Harwich is in the race. We're doing much better than most towns on sewering. We don't need to win the race. And by the DHY comment, never made it out of committee. So all the papers that have written that Harwich backed out, we didn't back out because there was no agreement. We didn't get to that point, and we as a board decided to pump the brakes because we were not ready to go back to town meeting after the mess that we made in East Harwich based on not having the data that's now being provided to us. Dan, how many gallons a day do you anticipate going to Chatham with Phase 2 Contract 1 and 2?
I want to say it was around 80,000 gallons for both fully connected.
The town of Harwich purchased 300,000 gallons a day capacity from Chatham. And we're paying the fixed costs on 300,000 gallons per day. So I think it's incumbent upon this board to do what we can in East Harwich and other parts of town and renegotiate with Chatham to send from other parts of town before we go and buy into another plant. That seems to me to be way, way, way out, and we are satisfying our obligations right now under all permits. And I think Carol said tonight that there's some guesses involved in what we're removing. So we need to remove as much as we're required to remove, and we should really try and remove more, because the whole point here is to remove nitrogen. So I appreciate the direction that you're going, and I think it's the direction we should go. As far as, was it Bascom Hollow?
Yeah.
Bascom Hollow, where is Continental and Witta compared to Bascom Hollow? Are they beyond it?
So, Jamie, if you can go back a slide. So,
Should be
on the
north.
bottom right, Continental and Witta is right between Church Street and 137, right near Northeast and Southwest.
So do we have to go by there now, Dan, or no?
We've already gone past on both sides.
Okay, so it seems like a no-brainer to me to
And then
come up with
Bascom,
something on Widow.
yeah, and then Bascom Hollow, you can see up in Lower Muddy Creek in red, or in the yellow parcel there, but we are at the fire station, which is just south of that.
Thank you. Don?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one more thing, because I don't want to blow by something that's kind of a headline in your conversation. You've got a 5-year moratorium coming up once they open up and reseal Route 28. I can foresee at some point that would be advantageous to have some piping there. So if we're in the spirit of gathering information, he should probably come up with a number for what dry pipe would cost, to be able to accomplish. And, we can evaluate it after that, but the conversation's worthwhile having.
Yeah, and I guess, Mike, to your point, with what we're projecting to flow to Chatham today, I'm estimating, I think it was 47,000 gallons and 34,000 gallons for Round Cove and Pleasant Bay. Those gallon quantities do not include I&I, inflow and infiltration, which will have to get added on top of that. Peaking factors and other things, but right now it's looking as though we're going to have surplus capacity.
Thank you. Any more comments from the board?
No.
I'll open it up to the public.
Hi, my name is Martha Donovan. I am a resident on Continental Drive, and I am the secretary of the Pleasant Bay Homeowners Association, which represents those 57 houses on Continental and Witta. So I just want to make sure that the record's clear. We did not move forward with the stump plans because there was some unscrupulous engineer. There was a town meeting in the fall of 2018. We were sent letters from the town in 2018 to have the stubs, if we wanted to, which we all did. We wanted to make sure they didn't go under our driveway or something like that, available for the March 2019 Phase 2. We didn't get taken off till phase 2 till after March of 2019. So we moved forward based on the information that the town gave us. I just want to make sure that's very clear. And as far as transparency and communication, we still have no idea why we were taken off of phase 2. We get there was a money issue, but there was some selecting that went on underneath there that we're totally blind to. And then my next point is, and I think this should be part of the consideration. That neighborhood was built in 1985. It's 36 years old. And for all of us who have a 36-year-old septic system, I think our preference would be to spend the money to hook up to the town sewer system. Yeah. And my final point of concern is, and we've talked about this as a group, and I'll say from somebody who moved down here in 2010, it was my second home, I live here permanently now, the thought of a septic system really bothered me. I came from a place where they had sewer systems. So what is being created here, in my opinion, and I think some of my neighbors would agree, is that if you're looking for a house in East Harwich, you can pick a house that has a sewer system versus a house that has a 36-year-old septic system. So for us, we're concerned about, yes, we put out $900. Yes, we have 36-year-old septic systems that could go at any time. But we also may have houses that have less of a value long-term because they're not connected to sewer. So I think those are also some considerations that we think about as homeowners. that I don't know have been brought up in terms of, if you look at that map, our neighborhood's the only one there, I think, that's not sewered. So what does that do to us in the long run? And that's our concern.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, sir.
First of all, I want to compliment Dan Pelletier. He has been extremely cooperative. Every time we needed to talk to Dan, he was available on his cell phone, and he'd even call me back on a Sunday. I mean, which is incredible for any government employee as far as I'm concerned. So thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
We've appreciated
You're welcome.
all the help you've tried to give us. As Martha explained, the first letter we got from the town is dated October 29th, 2018. And in that letter, it's clearly stated that Phase 2 included our two roads, Continental and Witta. And then it further goes on to say there's a 5-step process, and we'd like you to consider that and take note of it. Upon receipt of the sanitary sewer location form from CDM Smith, the town's engineering design consultant, you will be required to identify where on your property line you prefer your sewer stub to be located. If you have been working with a professional engineer and have considered the possibilities, you will be ready to confirm the location. So that was back in 2018. In 2019, 2 members of the town came to visit us at our annual meeting, and let's see. It was Chris Clark and, sorry, I have to. Charlie Sumner. Yeah, all right, Charlie Sumner. They came and attended our meeting and gave a presentation. They even prepared this nice little paper for us. So it wasn't by accident or willy-nilly or just, oh, we'll just do it. It was by direction for us. We were being told, and we were being proactive as a good citizens of a community, backing your sewer plan. We knew it was going to cost us money, but we were for it, and we still are for it. And on the back of this plan, you know, we were directed, almost, not directed, but it was suggested strongly that we go ahead and get the engineering done. We contacted Coastal Engineering. 40 homeowners signed up with Coastal, and we got all the engineering done. We're ready. Just tell us where you're going to run the line. We really want the sewers, and we hope that the town considers that. In the future, you may be looking for more nitrogen to take out of the water, and so you'll have a little extra, you'll be over, and that'll be a good thing for the town.
Agreed.
Thanks for the consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Susan Gaw, and I'm on Witta, which is spelled a little different than that. Sorry. I just really, it's just been bugging me for this whole year and a half or so. Why was our street passed over and then the shed put on Church Street right at the end of Continental, but we're not hooked up? You know, what was the thinking? I want to understand why our home was absolutely come right down 137 and just bypass us. So that's.
I'm going to point to the Dan Pelletier and try and get you an answer.
Before we get to number 2,
And I would just comment that I think from the comments and the strong recommendation from Dan and the comments from the board, we agree with you. We can get you whatever answers, looking back, that we can get you. But we agree with you right now that we should hook your street up.
Right.
We obviously haven't made that decision yet, but I don't want you to think walking out of here or think that all of you have to get up and say.
No.
Because we hear you. And,
I really just want to understand what.
and we have a lot of trust in Dan, and Dan has taken this, as you've commented, to the next level for us. And we have a lot more confidence in GHD than we had in our last engineer. So we are making corrective measures, and we hear you. So Dan, go ahead.
So as to why your street was ultimately cut, so the town appropriated a total of $24 million. I think it might have been 2018 town meeting. A lot of that was already committed. Some of it was committed to the pump station that we were building with the town of Chatham behind the corner store. Some of that was committed for design, for resident engineering. And when they put the first construction contract out to bid, it came over, the bids came in around $10.3 million. It was expected to be around $7.5 million worth of work. So we no longer had the freeboard, if you will, in the amount of money that was approved to do the full second construction contract, which would have included Continental and Witta. So what they did was referred to as a bid alternate, where they do a kind of a base bid, and then they have alternates where it was, your street was one alternate that we didn't have the funding to end up moving forward. For what it's worth, I knew you guys had spent some money and made the recommendation that that should have been one that was kept on, but ultimately it wasn't.
So what did the other?
You gotta jump back up to the microphone.
I'm so sorry.
Yep, no worries.
So, Susan again. So did those neighborhoods close,
You gotta talk to.
the other neighborhoods closer to the corner store go on that shed?
So the one that's at the end of Continental would be all of the parcels up above you in red on the right side of that screen. So topographically, everything's gonna run down Church Street to that pump station. Right after that pump station, the road goes up a little bit before it comes down to, so that pump station's moving the wastewater from that low spot over that crest and then down Church Street.
So then if you did hook us up, which we would.
You would
still
likely
want
be
to-
going both directions.
Okay.
We'd have to look at the topography, but.
Very good, thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you. Go ahead, ma'am.
So Jacqueline McKeon, Witta. So I understand what you're saying, but just so you know, I bought a house here, and I went to the town. I bought it last year. I went to the town in 2019. Dan, I met you when I was out running one day.
Oh, yeah.
They only temporarily approved my septic system. So I have to have an idea of what's going on, or I'm going to be double paying. And that, I would not have bought the house. So you've done me wrong as a taxpayer. And I've only been here not even a year, so not a happy girl.
Those are the ones we want to hear about, because that's.
And when I went to the town, she said, nope, you're on the list, here it is. I said, are you sure? She said, yes. I had to go find out that the house ended up, or the septic had a problem. There is a problem there, that I only have so much time before I have to tell them what I'm doing. So I'm on the watch list for the town. So now you're on my watch
And
list.
that's.
Thank you very much, and happy birthday.
Mark?
Mark Kelleher, West Harwich, non-Witter. But what a nice bunch of people you are. If I may have the chair's permission, I'd like to return to DHY. And Dan, correct me on this if you would. If we were in DHY, our portion of it, the Harwich portion, would be about $20 million. If we built it on our own, based upon Orleans, and I'm doing round figures, about $50 million. 45 Orleans is building now. And I'm splitting the difference. If we're in Dennis and Yarmouth, $35 million.
Mark, if I may, we'll take this up at another meeting.
Okay.
I'm not talking about DHY because DHY doesn't exist.
Okay.
So if you want to come back, send me a request to be on an agenda. If you want to revisit DHY,
Okay.
I'll have our town administrator speak to the other two towns.
Okay.
But it's a waste of conversation. I apologize.
That's all right.
But it's not on the agenda. Tonight's meeting is long enough, and we're not talking about DHY.
I'll wait till
For
the next
any
meeting.
reason. Thank you.
Something else.
Claire?
Clara McClarty. I have 4 different questions from what Dan said. So I'm curious how much overlap there is between the subwatersheds and the Pleasant Bay. Is the Pleasant Bay water, does that encompass the other 3 subwatersheds?
So that, and maybe I look to Mike for a little clarification, but that Pleasant Bay, as you're seeing on the screen, is not the full.
It's Little
it's like a
Pleasant Bay, right?
Pleasant
Yeah.
Bay, yes.
So if you over-remove in Lower Muddy Creek, does some of that over-removal help the target number for Pleasant Bay?
My understanding is that an over removal in Upper Muddy Creek doesn't result in us having to do less in Lower Muddy Creek, for example, if that
Okay,
fits here.
so we heard about nitrogen trading. Not over removing at Continental and Witta couldn't possibly help Brewster meet its goals. Am I correct? If it can't help us meet Pleasant Bay goals, how could it help?
Mike, do you want to?
Is that,
You want to take a shot?
am I
at this one?
oversimplifying this?
First, the entire Pleasant Bay is divided into 19 sub-watersheds. The entire system is called Pleasant Bay, but there's also a Pleasant Bay Main sub-watershed. That's the first question. Second thing, with nitrogen trading, it would be a question of, in the Pleasant Bay Main sub-watershed, Harwich would remove more than its share, so that Brewster could remove less than its share, and there'd be some financial. The way the sub-watersheds are delineated, that trade is possible. I think what you're suggesting is, could there be a trade between sub-watersheds? And why that might be possible, it's not a one-for-one. There's a much reduced equivalency factor between the two.
I don't understand. I believe you.
If you didn't get the explanation you want, maybe Carol could jump up.
Well, I think as a general statement, trades are more likely to be workable if both towns are within the same subwatershed. I think when you get into a situation where you're talking about separate subwatersheds, that becomes extremely problematic ecologically and potentially even economically, as Mike was saying. So I think the concept within subwatersheds. So I think to Clara's point, I believe, is, if Brewster isn't sharing in a subwatershed where we have excess capacity, the concept of trading becomes very difficult.
Thank you, Carol. Hold on one second. Hang on one second, sir. I'm going to let Clara, go ahead. Go ahead.
If this is on this topic.
Sir, is that related to this topic?
Yes, it is. I wanted to ask Carol something.
Go ahead.
Thank you. George Vermillier. The question, when you do all your calculations, were Continental and Witta included in phase 2? And when you did phase 2, did it include our streets?
Yes.
To get the numbers that you came up with?
So just to be clear, so the analysis that I presented, we didn't participate in the phasing of the work. That's really all within the comprehensive wastewater management plan. The numbers that I was sharing were the sub-watershed loads and load removal requirements, which are needed to achieve the regulatory thresholds. The towns take that information and they make the phasing of the plans. So that was all within the comprehensive wastewater management plan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Clara?
Thank you.
So I was trying to understand if this excess sewering of this neighborhood would be beneficial toward nitrogen trading. I'm still not clear, but I don't think so. Ecologically, this area doesn't compensate for a distant area. Okay, and then on the same concept with Bascom's Hollow, I may not have these details right, but as I understand it, developer wanted to build these, I call them Mick cottages, in that area, and should not, in my opinion, if I was running things, have been allowed to, because the sewer wasn't there, and he was allowed to put in Title V systems, which we know are ineffective and contribute to our nitrogen loading. But they were allowed to by the Board of Health because, well, they have a lawyer represent them, and they show up at the meeting and say, we're going to lose money if we can't build
I don't want to get into
all these
speculation.
houses.
Just get on
Well,
to your
it was
question.
covered in the paper. So we are paying how much money to accommodate a developer's profits at Bascom Hollow, which eat into the woodlands and don't help with affordable housing or any of the goals that we would like to see, maybe a lot of us would like to see. And I would just say that I would like to consider what we sewer going forward from the most ecological benefit, not to help any developers, not to help Bascom's Hollow avoid the expensive IAs. And I don't know what to do about the Continental and Whidden neighborhood, but the idea that we can sewer in excess in order to sell capacity to Brewster, I'm skeptical of that. I am worried that, well, my husband may speak about it, but he's crunched the numbers and come up with very different numbers where it's not like 300 versus 700, it's really much closer. And also, I think we should change current zoning rather than plan for build out under current zoning. I think we should be looking at changing current zoning as a way to reach our ecological goals to clean up water, and as well as, of course, the housing crisis. And then I also had a question about what % removal roughly is needed in that West Harwich area along 28 where the Department of Transportation is going to be doing work. Do you have any idea off the top of your head?
The nitrogen TMDL?
It's not like 100% needed area, right?
I don't believe so.
I don't think so either, from my memory.
It's like 62, but I'm going off the cuff here, so don't hold me to it.
So I'm very interested in having a conversation about areas that have a lower % removal required, or we consider other ways of handling it besides this expensive sewer infrastructure. And if we put pipes in the ground, there'll be another place that we're committed to sewer infrastructure, and we can't even have a discussion about whether IAs might be appropriate there and limits to growth there. So the more we move forward, although everyone's excited about getting some federal funding, if we get ahead of ourselves, we preclude all the conversations that we want to have to examine all the different opportunities. And I'd also like to say that I think to quickly do something because we might get some money from the federal government may be a logical fallacy. I would like to see the plan really well designed for the ecological benefit and the benefit of the community. And ultimately, federal money is our money. All tax money is money from people. So although I certainly understand the practical side that it's exciting to not have so much local taxes go up, our first priority is to design this accurately, effectively, and to consider the ecological impacts of where we sewer and why we sewer, or whether or not we use other technologies, and limits to development. And one other thing on that topic is if we should over-sewer in East Harwich in order to do trading in any part of East Harwich, we could get into a situation, from what I've read, where we do have to identify a recharge site because we could be taking out so much that we have to have recharge. And you mentioned that Hawk's Nest thing failing. We didn't like the recharge sites that were available in East Harwich, so that's another reason to limit our sewer infrastructure, because when you use on-site systems, you don't end up creating the need for a recharge zone where you dump a bunch of concentrated things back in.
Thank you.
With respect to 28 and the Herring River, the lots over there are small, postage stamp lots, so I would still recommend getting a dry pipe there, just because even if we wanted to deploy a different technology, I don't know that the lot size would be conducive to.
When you get us numbers, we'll have a much further conversation. Thank you, Dan.
Sandy McClarty. This may shed some light on the WIDA and Continental discussion. A lot of these homes are on what's called the Round Cove Well. Is that correct, Dan?
No, well.
Or they're in a well
Up in Lower Muddy Creek, not Upper Muddy Creek.
Are any of the homes in Continental and WIDA on well water?
No.
Okay. Absolutely not. So
We can't talk. We got to let him talk, and then you got to get up and talk at the microphone. We need to keep order, please.
So then this doesn't shed light on Continental and WIDA. I've looked at this map extensively. I'm missing some key things that were on my map, but there are a lot of homes that were in contract 3.
Which was Lower Muddy Creek. It would be Huckleberry Path,
Yeah.
actually Bascom Hollow. What you're referring to is the well sub-watershed, Muddy Creek well. That's within the Lower Muddy Creek.
Right. So
within there.
those homes should definitely not be sewered because their nitrogen is not going to the bay, the embayment, or the watershed. They're going to the well. Now, it's a long conversation, but we're getting credit for it, even though we're not actually improving the bay. And so this idea of over-sewering is a little bit concerning to me because the people in Continental and Witta are not paying for the sewer. They're paying a portion of it. We're asking the town to pay for this. And so while we can feel bad, and it sounds like a botched communication with this neighborhood, we're asking hardworking people in other areas to pay for this. And so I think ultimately the fiduciary, whatever the fancy word is to the whole, not just one little neighborhood. I think somebody on the board mentioned that, we got to compare dollars. Are we talking, if the association had to pay out some money, maybe we compensate them in order to save millions of dollars, because that's the kind of scale this sewer project is. And then the final comment, arcing back to the attenuation in Upper Muddy Creek, it looks like we're not getting the attenuation from the freshwater system. And so we would be getting more credit now because of our sewer. But this still leaves the question of the actual target hasn't changed. So if, for instance, the target was 100 kilograms per year, I'm just making this number up, and let's say 40% of that was being attenuated by a freshwater system, and 60% of it was being attenuated by our sewer. If all of a sudden you remove that attenuation from the freshwater system, you still have to get to that 100 number. You still have to remove 100 kilograms. And so the fact that now each home that we're sewering is more effective, per se, because they're not being attenuated, we're also losing the benefit of the attenuation. And so this is a question that has been asked, and I believe there isn't perfect clarity on this question, and I don't expect Dan to answer this or anybody, but I would basically just show caution. Don't get too excited that now we're getting all this credit from Upper Muddy Creek because of the new flushing from Jackknife Cove. I would just hold that as a cautionary note that freshwater system was doing something, and now it's not. And so at the end of the day, whether we remove it by sewer, whether it's removed by freshwater systems, it's all got to get removed. And so when we check the Sentinel stations in 5 years, although we get credit on our permit, when they check the actual water, that's what we're ultimately held to, not some credit from the state. It's ultimately that nitrogen has to be removed. And so those are the two cautions, the two statements, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy.
I guess just a couple things to note. With respect to Bascom Hollow specifically, that would be categorically new growth, which we would, under our plan, have to sewer 100% of. So, and I think it's important too, we have to get to Pleasant Bay and to Round Cove. And if you look at the map, we have to get there some way. So, whether it's up Church Street or up 39, we have to remove nitrogen from Pleasant Bay and Round Cove. I think that to pick up and further improve our removal efforts on the way makes sense, but.
Thank you, Dan. Any further comments?
None.
You all set, Larry? Dan, looking forward, what do you need from this board to continue recommended next steps?
So I think what I'm hearing from the board is they would like to see an estimate of what it would be to sewer Continental and Witta Drive.
I think an overall plan is more accurate. I
Okay.
think we want to look
All right.
at what the next contract 3 would look like, obviously including what we've discussed tonight.
Okay.
But we need to look at some numbers, and then we also need to look at a dry pipe number for 28.
Got it.
Is there any other direction that you need from us?
No.
I think that will get me where I need to go.
Thank you, and thanks to GHD for where they're at on this project.
If, before we let him go celebrate his birthday, is the board directing us to have that, the subgroup to engage in those conversations with our partners in Chatham?
Let me pull the board. Don?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mary? Larry?
Of course, yes.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
And think of me when you have a beer.
You were getting older even as you were sitting
I
here.
know. Getting more gray.
Easy, easy.
No. No, we've already done that.
We've done that.
Wastewater funding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and perhaps to give relief to everybody in the room this evening. You'll see on the agenda there's discussion of wastewater funding, and then the second item, the Water Infrastructure Investment Fund. They're all tied together, and really, given the late hour, what I was hoping we could do under this first item, under item E, is to just strategize, or not even strategize, just put out into the public sphere some of the funding opportunities or funding sources that may exist for wastewater. By not having an in-depth discussion tonight, we're not doing disservice, because you'll be getting again next week at your regular meeting a draft warrant for the special town meeting, which will include discussion on the Water Investment Infrastructure Fund, known as the WIF. We're also contemplating the Special Stabilization Fund that can be used to support wastewater infrastructure. But as an endpoint to the discussion you've had tonight, and recognizing, as I've said before, that this is a meeting that I don't think it's hyperbole to suggest that Dan, Carol, and I have been hoping to have in a room full of people without masks and as to begin the discussion of where we go from here. So to further that discussion, the question now comes, how do we pay for all of this? So you did hear us talk about a funding source that did not exist a year ago when we were contemplating it, may not exist a year from now, but it exists presently, and that, of course, is the ARPA funds that I spoke of earlier. So we can get into either generalities if the board would like, or we can carry this over to your meeting next week. Whatever you decide on that, we also do have in your packet information on the Water Infrastructure Investment Fund, as I've mentioned, lovingly referred to as a WIF. And the reason why I say that is I believe this is the first public meeting where we've been able to provide information to the board on that investment fund. It is something that had been talked about in years past, but nothing that we've taken the next step on. So if nothing else, we have that information in the public sphere.
So Joe, there's two funds that are being considered, that we've had initial conversations on. Could you just give us an overview of the two funds? I don't believe this is a can we need to kick down the road. This is a
Sure.
savings account for something that's gonna cost the town a ton of money. Will you give us an overview of what the two are?
So-
And we can get some sort of consensus from the board so you can move forward?
Sure. If by two you mean the WIF and then the Special Stabilization Fund?
Yes.
Thank you. So starting with the WIF, it is, as you can see in the packet, this is a fairly new, I think within the last decade, infrastructure fund that exists. Even though it has in its title that it's a Water Infrastructure Investment Fund, the materials that the Department of Revenue and Division of Local Services provide is it can also be used to impact upon wastewater. So we shouldn't be thrown off by the title. The original conversations that staff has had on this is that the town may contemplate establishing a Water Infrastructure Investment Fund when our land bank payments subside or end, and that's scheduled for fiscal year '24. And the reason why I say that is the town can earmark a percentage, much like we do with CPC to fund the land bank, and that percentage, I believe, is capped at 3%. So as we go forward on this discussion, the board and the town will have to contemplate, do we want to establish this investment fund? And if so, what is the threshold percentage that we want to divert tax revenue from the tax rolls into the fund? And do we want to do what other towns have done and I will say that I have to apologize after I say this because I haven't had a chance to speak with the chair of the Community Preservation Committee, but that is what some other towns have done, is they've impacted upon their CPC allocation to offset it by, say, reducing from 3% to a lower percent and using that difference as the percentage to fund this mechanism here. So there's quite a bit of discussion that needs to occur. Presently, I'm working with council to draft the language that could be contemplated for October if we wanted to, but certainly have to have a deeper discussion at the board level next week.
Okay. And what other funds can be put into this besides CPC funds?
I'm going to phone a friend if I could.
Lifeline.
I gave her the puppy dog eyes, so
Good
she felt
evening,
bad.
Carol Coppola. So with regard to what we're calling the WIF, the only other revenue that can go into that fund is investment revenue. So this would be in the hands of the treasurer. The treasurer would be responsible for investing those funds and then generating as much of a great return as she could, or he or she could. So with regard to a stabilization fund,
So on the WIF, Carol, just so that we're clear, 2024 is the soonest we can start putting money into that
well,
account?
I would say no.
Okay,
And the reason why I would say no is because the land debt is winding down quickly. In FY '24, fiscal year '24, the debt payment is about $165,000. So right now, 3% of a surcharge on real estate taxes is about $1.5 million that goes into the CPC funds. So you could impact it before. It's not saying that you couldn't.
okay. So longer conversation, Joe, but I think that we need to have that conversation and set this up sooner rather than later.
Certainly. And then to finish out the conversation, the Special Stabilization Fund was an article that was being contemplated for our May town meeting that just passed. Again, working with council on that. And that's exactly as it sounds. It's a stabilization fund, but specifically the funds are related to and earmarked for wastewater infrastructure. It's also governed by Chapter 40, which governs the WIF. And so there are certain parameters that the town has to be aware of. And I think the key point on that one is to draw out of that stabilization fund, like with any other, requires a 2/3 vote of town meeting. So it's meant to be a supermajority action of town meeting and for a very specific purpose. So we are working with council to craft that so that the board may consider next week adding that to the special town meeting in October.
Thank you. Don, questions on the, first, we'll take the WIF up first. Any questions or comments?
No, I mean, it just sounds like something we should be looking into. I know other towns have been talking about it at the Clean Waters Board up in Barnstable County, so other people are already acting on it.
Okay. Mary?
No, I'm good with what Joe and Carol have said.
Larry?
No, we've talked about it in the past, and I think that this will be we need a good public discussion, so now's the time to start it.
Thank you. On this, go ahead, Joe.
And then last comment really on when we talk about wastewater funding, again, the conversation that's happening tonight has been one that's been considered for quite some time by staff, and we've been trying to work on these issues as we get through pandemic and deal with everything else that's going on. But one of the directives from this board and predecessor boards was for staff to look at funding opportunities that aren't directly related to the operating fund or the general fund, and certainly beyond debt exclusions or things like that. So that's the effort that we're trying to do. Not to suggest that it isn't tax money, but in a different mechanism, in a different way. And finally, to try and give comfort to the general public in town meeting that we have a better handle on what we've been doing, and certainly have a better handle as we look towards the future on how to fund this, this mega project that exists.
So your intent is to bring both of these back next week?
Correct, in article form perhaps.
Okay. Any other questions from the board?
No, I'm gonna take this opportunity to pick on Selectman Howe. Don, can you bring us back to procedure for money, for seeking funds from the Clean Water, whatever the term of that is?
Yeah, well,
'Cause I think
we're going to wind up being a
working very
victim of my success there. I fought really hard to make sure that everybody would get something.
Right.
The fact that we got what we've gotten, which is more than $1 million in the first round, was indicative of we had finished a project and we were eligible to be considered because it was an eligible project. Anything new, we'd go back to the back of the line again and queue up along with the other towns for new things.
That's why I'm asking, just exactly what that procedure is to queue up again.
It was supposed to be to keep the fund liquid and to give everybody an opportunity to get something
No,
out of
I
it.
appreciate that, just that we understand what the steps are. But
That was easy.
It's a great job, yeah.
Thank you. Comments from the public on, or questions on the funding? Town administrators report?
There is none.
Selectmen's report?
No, good meeting.
Mary?
Very good meeting. And the snack shack was fabulous last Friday night. Larry and I were there. Separately.
We're doing our due diligence.
Don came, one of you have to leave. Don, any comments, Selectmen's report?
Were there snacks? That's all I want to know.
Dan?
If I may, I just wanted to thank Mary for her work in helping us get the telephone pole on Church Street in front of the pump station replaced. We tried for months and months and months to no avail, and a few phone calls from Mary, and they were out there the next day. So
You see the list of
Selectmen
100
at work.
Do you
Thank
see
you.
the list of 180 in the packet next week? Motion to adjourn?
So moved. Chairman, just a reminder if I could.
Go
Your
ahead.
next meeting is Tuesday, September 7th, because that's the day after Labor Day, to really put a knife in it. And that'll be 6:30 here in Griffin Room.
Excellent.
Michael, I think you have
before
one more,
before we adjourn, I'd like to actually thank the chair too for putting this together. This has been so long in the making.
Well, thank you all.
Second.
And thank all of them. This is the busiest meeting we've had.
Move to adjourn.